She bowed in shame when the Duke introduced her, as nobody important, in the royal ball. Clara Whitmore had exactly 40 minutes to decide whether she was brave enough to walk through those palace gates. She stood on the cobblestone path outside the Grand Aldenmere Palace, her borrowed ivory gown slightly too long at the hem, her hands gripping a small cream envelope that had no business being in her possession. Around her, carriages rolled past. Women in deep blue and emerald green stepped out from the doors of polished cars with the ease of people who had always belonged in places like this. Their jewelry caught the light from the palace lanterns and threw it back in sharp little flashes, like they were winking at the world, daring it to look. Clara looked. She always looked at things carefully. It was her job, after all. She worked with old things, fragile things, things that fell apart if you held them wrong. She had spent 6 years learning how to see what other people missed: a cracked wax seal, a thread of ink that ran the wrong direction, the faint impression of a stamp on a page that had been pressed once, erased, and pressed again differently. She noticed things. And right now, she noticed that every single woman walking through those gates moved like the night belonged to her. Clara moved like she was checking whether the night had room for her at all. She looked down at the envelope again. It had arrived 3 days ago, tucked inside the front cover of a leather-bound manuscript she had been restoring at the Royal Heritage Library. The manuscript was from the early 1800s, its pages delicate as old skin. She had been working on it for 2 weeks. When the envelope fell out from between the cover board and the first page, she had assumed it was a bookmark, some old correspondence that had been stored inside the book long ago. But the wax seal on the back was fresh, dark red, not brittle, not cracked. And the crest pressed into it was unmistakable. She had seen it 100 times in the archive records she managed every day. It was the crest of the Harrington house, the crest of the Duke. The letter inside was short, written in clean formal print on heavy cream paper. You are cordially invited to the annual Royal Heritage Ball, held at the Grand Aldenmere Palace, on the 14th of this month. Your presence is requested, in connection with matters pertaining to the Royal Archive collection. That was all. No name signed at the bottom. Just the crest again, pressed in ink this time, at the footer of the page. Clara had read it 4 times standing at her work table, her white archival gloves still on, the magnifying lens she used for detail work sitting on the tray beside her. She had turned the envelope over, checked the postmark. There was none. It had not come through the mail. It had been placed inside the manuscript, deliberately, by someone who knew she would open that particular book on that particular week. Someone knew her work schedule. Someone wanted her there tonight. And that was the reason she was standing outside the palace gates on a Thursday evening, in an ivory gown that was not hers, with shoes that pinched slightly at the toes, and a small handbag containing her phone, her lip balm, a folded notepad, and a mechanical pencil. She was not here for the ball. She was here because 3 months ago, she had found something in the archive that she had not been able to stop thinking about since. A land deed from 1887, a document that should have been straightforward, a transfer of a modest estate called Heronfield from one family to another, the kind of document that passed through old archive collections by the hundreds. Nobody paid much attention to them. Clara had paid attention. The ink on the deed was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not obviously wrong, but Clara had spent years studying historical inks, their compositions, their behavior on aged paper. The iron gall ink used in the 1880s oxidized a specific way over time, turned a specific shade of brown-black, spread into the paper fibers in a particular pattern. This deed looked right at first glance. The paper was genuinely old. The handwriting was period accurate. But the ink had not oxidized correctly, and the seal pressed into the bottom right corner of the page, the official stamp of the kingdom's land registry, had a hairline fracture in it that did not match any other registry seal from that period that Clara had in the comparison collection. It matched, almost exactly, a seal cutter's record from 1941. Someone had taken a genuinely old piece of paper and written a false deed on it using a deliberately aged ink recipe, then pressed it with a recut version of the original registry stamp. The forgery was excellent. It would fool almost anyone. It did not fool Clara. The beneficiary named on the false deed was the Harrington estate. She had said nothing to anyone yet. She had no proof of intent. She had no chain of custody on the document. no record of who had donated it to the archive or when. All she had was her own forensic certainty and a growing list of questions. And now, an unsigned invitation bearing the Harrington crest, tucked inside a manuscript she had been restoring in the restricted access room of the Royal Heritage Library. The restricted access room, where only senior archive staff were permitted without an accompanying senior official. Someone had been in that room. Clara pressed the envelope flat against her palm and walked through the palace gates. The first thing she felt was the noise. Not loud noise, not chaotic noise. The kind of noise that 100 well-dressed people make when they are all being careful to sound refined, while also trying to be heard. A low, warm roar of conversation, threaded through with the sound of a string quartet, playing somewhere beyond the main entrance hall. Chandeliers blazed overhead, their light so warm and golden that it made everyone look slightly better than they probably were. The second thing Clara felt was the weight of not belonging. It was not a sharp feeling. It was not painful in the way a cut is painful. It was more like the feeling of wearing the wrong coat in cold weather. Not quite enough, not quite right. Functional, but noticeably off. She had felt this feeling before, many times. She handed her invitation to the man at the entrance, a tall herald in a dark uniform, with gold trim on the collar. He looked at it, looked at her, and then looked at the invitation again. He cleared his throat. "Name?" he said. "Clara Whitmore," she told him. He consulted his list, found her name. She could tell by the slight pause that followed. The pause that meant he had found it, but it was not circled or starred or highlighted the way the names of important guests were. "Miss Clara Whitmore," he announced to the room, his voice carrying the professional neutrality of a man who was paid to announce names without judgment. "Archivist." That was all. No title before her name. No estate name after it. Just archivist. As if that were all she was. As if that were a small thing. Around her, the crowd shifted and settled. Nobody looked up. A woman in a gown the color of midnight laughed at something her companion said. A man near the champagne table reached for a glass without glancing toward the door. Two young women standing beside a flower arrangement whispered to each other and did not bother to lower their voices much. Clara walked into the room. She had made a plan before she came tonight. She always made plans. She was not a person who walked into situations without knowing what she intended to do there. The plan was simple. Locate the historical portrait gallery on the east wing of the palace, which she knew from the archive's architectural records contained several paintings donated by the Harrington family in the 1920s. Among those donations, according to the archive catalog, was a set of framed documents, letters, mainly, one of which was listed in the original donation record as Land Transfer Correspondence, undated. She wanted to see that correspondence. She made her way through the crowd carefully, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing tray, not because she wanted it, but because holding a glass made her look purposeful, rather than lost. She smiled at no one in particular, and let her eyes move over the room with the same methodical attention she gave to any new collection of objects. She catalogued the space. The ballroom was enormous, its ceilings vaulted and painted in soft gray and gold, 4 chandeliers, 2 sets of French doors opening onto a terrace, a raised platform at the far end where the string quartet played, tables draped in white along the east wall, holding food and drink, and along the south wall, a row of historical portraits in gilded frames. She moved toward the portraits. They were exactly what she expected. Formal, stiff oil paintings of people who had been important enough a century ago to be painted, but not so famous that most modern people would know their names. Lords and ladies of various estates, men in military dress, women in high collars, all of them looking out from their frames, with the particular expression of people who had agreed to sit still for a very long time, in exchange for being remembered. Clara stood before a large portrait of a man, in a dark green coat, reading the small brass plate at the bottom of the frame. Edmund Harrington, 1st Duke of Aldenmuir, 1851 to 1923. She looked at his face. It told her nothing. She moved to the next painting, then the next. She had been standing there for perhaps 10 minutes, making mental notes, when she heard footsteps behind her slow and stop. She did not turn around immediately. She kept her eyes on the painting in front of her. A landscape this time. Rolling hills and a gray sky. A house in the middle distance that she recognized from the archive maps as Heronfield. Heronfield. the estate named on the forged deed. Her breath stayed even. Her hands stayed still. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying the brushwork, which she was, because it genuinely was interesting, and because she did not want whoever had stopped behind her to think she had noticed them. "The light in that one has always bothered me," said a voice. It was a man's voice, deep and measured, the kind of voice that was used to being listened to without having to raise itself. Clara turned. He was tall. That was the first thing. Tall and straight-backed in a dark formal jacket with a single military decoration on the left breast. His hair was dark, cut neatly. His face was the kind of face that carried authority, as naturally as other people carried expressions. Not handsome in a soft way. Sharply constructed. High cheekbones. A jaw that looked like it had been designed to hold firm opinions. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the painting. "The horizon line is too high," he continued. The painter was technically skilled, but he didn't understand how light moves over that kind of landscape in the afternoon. "The shadows are wrong." He turned then, and his eyes met hers. Dark eyes. They passed over her the way a person's eyes pass over furniture they see every day. Present, registered, moved past. "Do you paint?" he asked, the question clearly perfunctory. "No," Clara said. "I restore." He said nothing to that. A man appeared at his elbow, a shorter man in a gray suit, and leaned in to say something quietly. The Duke, because she knew from his portrait in the archive collection that this was Duke Alden Harrington, the current Duke of Aldenmere, turned slightly toward his companion and nodded once at something said to him. The shorter man glanced at Clara. "Who is this?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the automatic assessment of someone managing a guest list in his head. The Duke glanced back at her briefly. "Nobody important," he said. "She works in our archives." Then he turned away and walked toward the center of the room. Clara stood still. She did not move for 3 full seconds. She was counting them, the way she counted heartbeats when she needed to stay calm during delicate restoration work. 1, 2, 3. Then she lowered her head, not in deference, not in agreement. She lowered it because the heat that had rushed into her face was sudden and fierce, and she did not want anyone to see it on her. She had spent years learning not to let her face give her away, but that, coming from him, in that easy, dismissive tone, as though she were a piece of furniture he was identifying for a guest, that had gotten past her defenses before she had time to raise them. Nobody important. She stood there for another moment, her eyes on the marble floor, the champagne glass warm now in her hand. Then she lifted her head. She looked at the painting of Harenfield again, the estate that should have passed to her family, the estate that had been taken through a document that should not exist, a document that sat in the archive she managed, in the collection that bore his family's name. She looked at the landscape, the wrong shadows, the too high horizon. She thought, he is right about the painting, the light is wrong, but he is wrong about me. She turned and walked calmly toward the east wing corridor, her glass held at an easy angle, her steps measured. She had work to do. She had always had work to do. The only thing that had changed tonight was that now she understood, with perfect clarity, exactly who she was doing it for. She was doing it for the woman who had just bowed her head, and she was doing it to make sure she never had to do it again. The corridor beyond the main ballroom was quieter. Her footsteps echoed slightly on the polished stone floor. Ahead of her, the east wing opened into the palace's historical gallery, its doors propped open for the evening, as part of the curated tour that the ball program listed as optional for guests. A small printed card on a brass stand at the corridor entrance read, Heritage Gallery. Open 8 to 10 p.m. Guided tours available. She did not need a guide. She stepped through the doors. The gallery was long and cool, lit by soft, warm lighting along the baseboards and overhead spotlights trained on specific pieces. Glass cases held documents and objects arranged by century. On the walls, portraits continued from the ballroom, but these were older, darker, their varnish thick with age, and along the far wall, in a series of dark wooden frames, were the document displays. Clara walked toward them steadily. She found the Harrington donation section easily, a set of 6 frames grouped together, each containing a document or letter behind glass. The archive listing she had memorized came back to her now in clean order. 5 letters, one listed as land transfer correspondence, undated. She found it. third frame from the left. She leaned forward and looked at it through the glass. It was a single page, handwritten. The ink faded to a warm brown. The handwriting was different from the deed she had examined in the archive. Older, she thought. Genuinely older. But the phrasing in the lines she could make out. The light here was not ideal. Used terms that matched the legal language of the forged deed almost exactly. She pulled out her notepad and pencil and began writing. Behind her, from the direction of the main ballroom, the string quartet had moved into a new piece. Something slow and formal. The sound reached the gallery in a thin thread, softened by distance and stone walls. Clara wrote quickly and neatly, copying down what she could read of the displayed letter, her handwriting small and precise. She was almost finished when she heard footsteps enter the gallery behind her. More than one person. She heard voices, low and polite, the sound of guests on the optional tour. She did not stop writing. She finished her notes, capped her pencil, and closed her notepad. Then she stepped back from the frame and turned, composing her face into the expression of a person who had been admiring a historical display, which was entirely true. A couple was making their way slowly along the opposite wall, studying the portraits with the pleasant distraction of people who were spending an evening somewhere beautiful. They did not look at Clara. She walked back toward the ballroom. She had what she came for. The letter in that frame was connected to the deed. She was certain. She needed to see the full archive record of how that letter had been catalogued, and she needed to see the sealed storage box that the Harrington family's donation had arrived in, which was listed in the archive inventory as being held in the palace vault since 1923, never opened, its contents logged only from the original donation manifest. She needed access to that vault. She did not have it. Not yet. She stepped back into the noise and warmth of the ballroom. The string quartet was playing something lighter now. People were beginning to move toward the dance floor. A man near the entrance was laughing loudly at his own joke, his face red with champagne and good cheer. Clara stood at the edge of the room and looked at the crowd. Somewhere in this room was the answer to why that invitation had been placed in her manuscript. Someone had wanted her here tonight. Someone knew what she was looking for, or knew what she would find, or both. And she was standing in a room full of people who had just heard her described as nobody important, holding a notepad full of evidence, and wearing shoes that pinched. She set her champagne glass down on the nearest tray. She straightened her spine. She had not come this far by accident. She had not restored 1,000 fragile, broken things to walk away from this one. She stayed at the edge of the ballroom for exactly 7 minutes before she moved again. 7 minutes was enough time to watch the room settle into its rhythms. She could see who knew whom, who was avoiding whom, who was pretending not to look at someone while very obviously looking at them. Clara had spent enough time in quiet, observant work to understand that people told you more about themselves when they thought you were not watching than they ever would in direct conversation. The Duke was across the room. She could see him without looking at him directly, which was a skill she had practiced since childhood, the ability to take in a peripheral image and hold it clearly without turning her head. He was speaking to an older man in a dark suit, someone who had the bearing of a government official, the particular rigid posture of a person who had trained themselves never to look unsure in public. The Duke stood slightly sideways to him, one hand in his jacket pocket, nodding at measured intervals. He had not looked in her direction since he walked away from her. She had not expected him to. That was not the thing that stayed with her. The thing that stayed was the easiness of it, the way the words had come out of him without any effort at all. Not cruel, not considered, simply automatic. The way a person names a chair or a lamp, an object in the room, something present but not significant. Nobody important. She had heard words like that before. Not in those exact words, sometimes, but in the shape of them. In the pause before someone introduced her at a conference and had to decide whether to mention her father's name. In the way a senior official at the archive had once signed her performance review, with a note that said, "Demonstrates strong technical competence," which was true and accurate, and had somehow still felt like being handed a participation certificate rather than recognition. She had learned to carry those moments without showing what they cost her. She was carrying this one now. She picked up a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray, not because she wanted it, but because she needed her hands to be doing something. She moved to the right side of the room, along the wall, following the line of the portraits she had been studying earlier. From here, she could see both the main entrance and the corridor that led to the east wing. She kept her eyes moving, quiet and steady. A young woman appeared at her shoulder. She was perhaps 24, with light brown hair pinned up in an elegant arrangement that must have taken someone considerable time to create, and a gown the color of pale sage. She had the slightly searching look of someone who had also arrived alone, and was now performing the careful art of not appearing to need company. "These portraits are remarkable, aren't they?" the young woman said, gesturing toward the nearest painting with her glass. "They are," Clara agreed. She looked at the portrait, a woman from perhaps the 1890s, by the style of her dress, dark hair, an expression that conveyed patience as the only available option. "I always wonder what they were actually thinking," the young woman said. "The people in old portraits, they had to sit still for so long, hours. Do you think they got bored?" "Almost certainly," Clara said, "though I suspect the more experienced subjects learn to use the time productively. You can think quite clearly when your body is still." The young woman laughed. It was a genuine laugh, surprised and warm. "I've never thought of it that way. I'm Harriet," she said. "Harriet Lowe. My father is on the Heritage Conservation Board, which is why I'm here. I spend most of these evenings standing near the food and trying to look interested in the architecture."
Clara Whitmore,
Clara said. "I work in the Royal Archive. That's my reason for being here too, more or less." "Do you enjoy it?" Harriet asked. "The archive work?" "Very much," Clara said, and meant it completely. Harriet looked at her, with the small assessment that people make when they are deciding whether someone is interesting or merely polite. Apparently she decided interesting, because she stepped slightly closer and lowered her voice in the comfortable way of someone about to say something real rather than social. "I overheard something rather awkward a little while ago," Harriet said. "Near the portrait gallery entrance, someone said something dismissive about an archivist, and I thought, what a strange thing to say at a heritage event. As though the archive staff aren't the reason any of this history is preserved at all." Clara looked at her steadily. "People sometimes don't think about where things come from," she said. "They see the result without considering the process." Harriet nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. They stood together for a few minutes in comfortable silence, and Clara was grateful for it. The presence of another person who was not demanding anything from her, not assessing her, not deciding what category to place her in, just standing near her in a difficult room and finding the same paintings worth looking at. Across the room, something shifted. Clara noticed it before she could name what it was. A small change in the social geography of the space, people rearranging themselves, a slight increase in the collective attentiveness of the crowd. Then she understood why. A woman had entered through the main doors. She was perhaps 30, or close to it, tall, in a gown the color of deep burgundy that had been constructed with obvious expense and equal skill. Her hair was dark gold, worn in a style that was formal, but carried the kind of careless elegance that only comes from never having had to think too hard about any of it. She moved across the room with the ease of a person who had been arriving at rooms like this one since before she could fully form memories of it. The crowd adjusted around her the way water adjusts around a stone, not dramatically, just naturally, opening a path and closing again behind her. "Lady Serena Ashford," Harriet said quietly beside Clara. Her voice was neutral, but careful. "She and the Duke are expected to announce their engagement tonight." Clara looked at the woman, then at the Duke, who had turned from his conversation and was now crossing the room toward her. He moved with the same contained authority he always did, but Clara noticed that his jaw had tightened slightly, and his pace was slightly more deliberate than relaxed. He was performing warmth. It was a very good performance. But Clara had spent years reading old manuscripts, and she knew the difference between the original text and a careful copy. Lady Serena reached him and extended both her hands, which he took briefly. They exchanged a few words. He smiled. She smiled. The people nearest them smiled in the reflected light of it, which was how these things worked. Clara looked away. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel in that moment. There was no particular bitterness. The man had dismissed her in fewer words than it took to order a drink. There was nothing between them that warranted a complicated emotion. She felt, if anything, the clean clarity of knowing exactly who she was dealing with. A man who moved through the world treating people as either significant or not significant, and who had, in one brief glance, placed her firmly in the second category. That was useful information. She filed it where she filed all useful information. Carefully, clearly, in a place she could access when she needed it. She turned back to Harriet. "Would you excuse me?" she said. "I need to make a phone call." Harriet nodded easily. "Of course. It was lovely to meet you, Clara." "And you," Clara said, and meant it. She moved toward the far end of the room where the corridor that led to the terrace opened up, and found a quieter corner near a window that looked out over the dark palace gardens. The lanterns in the gardens threw pools of yellow light across the trimmed hedges. It was very beautiful. She barely looked at it. She got out her phone and opened the notes application, not to make a call but to review what she had written while at the document display in the gallery. She needed to think, and she needed to think clearly, which was harder in a crowded room, but not impossible. The letter in the gallery display, third frame from the left in the Harrington donation section, single page, handwriting older and genuinely of the period, ink properly oxidized. The visible phrasing matched the legal language of the 1887 deed she had examined in the archive. Specifically, the phrase referring to the estate property boundary, which used a particular archaic legal term for boundary demarcation that had been out of use by the mid-1890s. A forger replicating the period language would naturally look at genuine documents from that era. If the letter in the gallery display was a genuine original document, and the deed in the archive used the same term, one explanation was that whoever forged the deed had used this letter as a reference, which meant the letter and the deed were connected. And if the letter had been donated to the palace by the Harrington family, and the deed was in the archive, in a collection also donated by the Harrington family, then someone in that family, or someone close to them, had created the false deed, using an authentic Harrington family document as a template. The question was whether the current Duke knew. She put her phone away. She had been operating on the principle that she did not know the answer to that yet. She still did not know. But the question had acquired a new texture since she had heard him speak. He was precise. He was observant. He had noticed the light in a landscape painting was wrong. He was the kind of person who paid attention to details. Was he the kind of person who would look the other way from a wrong thing because it benefited his family? Many people were. Many very intelligent, observant, careful people were. She had no answer to that yet. She went back into the ballroom. The evening had shifted its weight again. The formal part of the night was approaching. She could tell by the subtle change in how the staff were moving, the way the musicians had shifted into softer background music, the way the senior herald was consulting with a colleague near the raised platform at the far end of the room. Clara positioned herself near the central area, not at the front but with a clear sight line. Whatever was about to happen, she wanted to see it. The herald stepped up to the platform. The room quieted with practiced efficiency. He welcomed the guests. He thanked the Heritage Conservation Board, which caused a small round of polite applause. He made reference to the evening's curated heritage display, which caused another. Then he cleared his throat and said that His Grace the Duke of Aldenmere had a brief announcement. The Duke moved forward. Clara watched him. He was comfortable in front of a crowd. Not the way some people were comfortable, bouncing and eager. He was comfortable the way a wall is comfortable with being vertical, settled, certain of itself. He thanked the guests. He spoke about the Heritage Ball's tradition, 240 years of it. He said something graceful and brief about the importance of preserving what had been entrusted to the present generation by the past. Then he turned to Lady Serena Ashford, who had moved to stand slightly to his left. He announced their engagement. The room produced a warm wave of applause, genuine, mostly. Clara clapped once and stopped. Lady Serena smiled. Her smile was perfect. Clara wondered if she was happy. It was genuinely impossible to tell. That was either the sign of a very composed woman, or a very practiced one. Perhaps both. These were not mutually exclusive. The Duke looked out at the room, with his controlled, formal expression. For just a second, just the smallest fragment of a moment, his eyes moved across the crowd, and stopped somewhere. Not at her. She was not foolish enough to think that. She was at the left side of the room, and he was scanning right to left. His gaze passed over her area of the room, and moved on without pause. She was, as she had been told, nobody worth pausing for. She felt it again, that wave of heat. She pressed it down. Then she thought of the letter in the gallery frame. She thought of the forged deed, with its wrong ink, sitting in an archive box 2 miles from here. She thought of her father, Edmund Whitmore, who had died at 61 believing that the world had decided he was nobody important, and that the world had probably been right. He had not been right to believe that. And she was not going to stand in this room and let history repeat itself, because a man in a military jacket had not thought to look at her properly. She straightened her gown. She set her jaw. She began making her way toward the historical gallery again, because she had noticed something in the third frame, something she had not quite captured in her notes, a name in the lower left corner of the letter that she had only partially been able to read in the light available. She needed to read that name. The corridor to the east wing was slightly darker than before. The formal part of the evening had brought more of the guests into the central rooms and thinned out the people who had been wandering. Clara moved quickly and quietly. She reached the gallery. Still open, still lit, but emptier now. 2 older gentlemen stood near the far end, consulting about something in one of the display cases. Clara went directly to the Harrington donation section. She leaned close to the third frame again, the letter inside, behind the glass. She found the lower left corner. The name there was partial, the last part of a surname. The first letters were obscured by the edge of the mounting board inside the frame, something that should not have happened. Proper archival display mounting preserved the full document. Someone had remounted this letter at some point and had done it carelessly, or deliberately, covering the beginning of a name. What she could read was, Itmore. She stayed very still. She read it again. Itmore. It could be many things. Many names ended with those letters, or contained them. She knew that. She was precise about such things. She did not jump to conclusions. But her father's name was Whitmore. And her family's name, before a marriage and a title reduction 2 generations back, had been Whitmore. An old spelling. A very old spelling. She stood back from the frame. She put her notepad away. She kept her face entirely still. Somewhere behind her in the gallery, the 2 gentlemen had moved closer, still talking. She heard one of them say, "The Harrington collection," and then something she could not quite catch. She turned and walked back toward the ballroom at a measured pace. She did not allow herself to feel the full weight of what she had just seen. Not yet, not here, not in this room, in this borrowed gown, where she had already bowed her head once tonight, and where she refused, absolutely refused, to bow it again. She walked into the warmth and light of the ballroom, and stood among the people who did not know her name, and she breathed steadily, and she thought, this changes everything. And also, this changes nothing about what I have to do. She had always been going to find the truth. She was just beginning to understand how close to her own door that truth lived. She spent another hour at the ball after that. She did not let herself leave before the hour was up, because leaving early would suggest flight, and she was not fleeing anything. She walked the room. She spoke to Harriet again briefly, and to a retired conservator she recognized from a conference 2 years ago, and to a young archivist from a different institution, who asked her technical questions about ink oxidation patterns that she answered carefully and well. She was professional. She was composed. She was present. She was also thinking at full speed the entire time, running what she knew against what she suspected, checking the structure of her theory the way she checked the structure of a damaged document, looking for places where it could fall apart, testing the joins. The letter in the frame was connected to the deed. The name in the corner was partially obscured. The mounting had been done poorly, or with deliberate intent. The Harrington family had donated both the gallery letter and the archive collection that contained the deed, and the forged deed had benefited the Harrington estate at the expense of a family whose old surname bore a striking resemblance to the letters visible in that corner. Her family. She could not prove it yet. She needed to. She needed access to the full donation record, and she needed access to the sealed vault box listed in the 1923 archive inventory. She needed to find the original chain of custody for both documents and trace them back to the first moment either of them appeared in the Harrington paper trail. She needed help she did not yet know how to ask for. She also needed, very badly, to go home and sit quietly in her apartment and let herself feel the thing she was pressing down, the cold and particular shock of standing in a palace and discovering, in a frame behind glass, that the wrong done to her family might be legible in 7 letters if you knew where to look and how to read them. She left the ball at 10 minutes past 10. She retrieved her coat from the attendant. She walked through the palace gates. She found the car she had arranged to take her home, a modest hire car, driven by a quiet man who did not try to make conversation. She sat in the back seat and watched the palace recede through the rear window, its lights warm and gold against the dark sky, full of people who did not know her name or her story, or the things she was carrying out of their beautiful room. She thought about what the Duke had said. Nobody important. She thought about what she was going to do with what she knew. She thought, every piece of evidence I have ever found, I found because I paid attention to the thing that everyone else walked past. She looked out the window at the dark city moving past. She was going to pay attention to this. She was going to pay attention to all of it, to every thread and every discrepancy and every half-obscured letter at the corner of an improperly mounted display document, until the full truth of it was laid out clearly and completely, and could not be ignored by anyone in any room, regardless of whose name was announced at the door. She was nobody important. She smiled, very slightly, at the passing dark. She had heard worse things said about people who changed everything. The morning after the ball, Clara sat at her kitchen table before sunrise, with a cup of tea she had not drunk yet, and a piece of paper in front of her, on which she had written a single word: Whitmore. She looked at it for a long time. Her apartment was small and deeply familiar. Books along every wall, organized by subject and then by century. A narrow window that looked out over the bookshop below, which did not open until 9. At this hour, the street outside was quiet, and the light was the particular blue-gray of early morning, before the sun committed to rising. She had grown up, knowing her family history, the way most people know the floor plan of the house they were raised in, by feel rather than by reading. The stories had been passed to her in pieces, not in any formal sitting down and telling, but in the way her father would sometimes pause in front of an old photograph, or hold a document for a second longer than necessary, before setting it down. The Whitmore family had been, 3 generations back, a family of modest but genuine standing, not nobility, not aristocracy, but landowners, with a small estate in the country that her great-great-grandfather had built over decades of careful management. The estate was called Heronfield. Clara had known about Heronfield since she was 9 years old. She had seen a photograph of it once, a black-and-white image in her father's collection of papers, a house of medium size, stone-fronted, with a long garden visible at the side. Her father had told her it had been beautiful. He had never told her why they no longer had it. She had been 23 when she found out the real reason. She had been finishing her archival studies, writing a research paper on 19th-century land transfer records. In the course of that research, she had accessed the General Land Registry archive and found, almost by accident, a reference to the Heronfield estate in a catalogue of properties changed over in the late 19th century. The record was brief. It gave the date of transfer as 1887, the parties as a former owner, and the Harrington estate, and a reference number for the deed. She had looked up the deed. The deed she found in the archive was the one she now knew to be false. She had not known that at 23. She had been a student, not yet trained in forensic document analysis, and she had looked at the deed the way a student looks at things, for content rather than for authenticity. She had read that her family's estate had been transferred to the Harrington family in 1887, in what appeared to be a standard land sale. She had told her father. She remembered the evening. They had been in his small house, the only house he had lived in after everything fell apart. He was sitting in the armchair by the window with a cup of tea, his hands around the mug in the way they always were when he was tired, and she had told him that she had found the transfer record, that the estate had been sold in 1887, that it had not been taken, as some family story suggested. It had been sold. Her father had been quiet for a very long time. Then he had said, "It was not sold, Clara. It was taken, but I could never prove it." He had known. He had spent decades knowing, and he had been unable to do anything with that knowledge, because without a clear provable wrong, all he had was a story that made him sound like a bitter man, making excuses for a family's decline. She had not known enough then to find the proof. She knew enough now. She picked up her pen and wrote below the name, Heronfield, 1887 deed, Harrington donation, gallery letter, frame 3. obscured corner, letters visible. Whitmore. She wrote, "Old spelling of Whitmore was Whitmore. Family records confirm this. Last documented use of old spelling, 1843, in a church record in the county of Aldenmere." She drew a line connecting the words. She sat back and looked at what she had drawn. If the letter in the gallery frame was a genuine document from the 1843 to 1880 period, and it bore the old spelling of her family's name, it was possible the letter was original Whitmore family correspondence, family papers, documents that should have descended with the family, or at least remained in neutral custody. They were in the Harrington Gallery, behind glass, in a frame with bad mounting that covered the name. She thought about her father. She thought about the careful, deliberate way he had kept his own collection of papers, the box under his bed that she had not opened until after he died. Inside it, the photograph of Harenfield, 3 old letters in handwriting she had not been able to read fully, a copy of his own birth certificate, and a single handwritten note in his own writing that said only, "Someone should know." She had been carrying that note in her memory like a stone in her shoe for 4 years. She picked up her phone now and called the archive. It went to the general voicemail, because it was not yet 7 in the morning. She left a message for her colleague, a careful and reliable man named Jeffrey Marsh, who managed the physical accession records. She asked him to pull the full donation manifest for the Harrington family collection, specifically the 1923 donation, and to have it ready for her when she came in. She was precise about what she needed. She always was. Then she drank her tea, which had gone cold, and began to get ready for work. She arrived at the archive at 5 minutes to 9. The building was a converted mansion, 3 streets from the Palace District. Its exterior stately, but its interior practical, reorganized decades ago for climate-controlled storage and research access. She had worked here for 6 years. She knew every room, every cabinet, every quirk of the ventilation system that made the east wing slightly too dry in winter. Jeffrey was at his desk. He was a man of around 50, with reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and the particular patience of someone who had organized large quantities of information for long enough that nothing surprised him anymore. "Your Harrington Manifest," he said, and handed her a folder. "Thank you," she said. She went to her own desk, set down her bag, and opened the folder. The manifest was a typed document from 1923, prepared when the Harrington family donated a collection of family papers to the Royal Heritage Archive as part of an estate reorganization following the death of the then Duke. It ran to 14 pages. Clara began reading from the beginning and did not stop for 40 minutes. The collection comprised 163 individual items: letters, ledgers, legal documents, household accounts, photographs, and 1 sealed wooden box described as follows. Contents unknown. Sealed by the late Duke per his instruction box, is to remain sealed and stored in perpetuity, its contents to be accessed only with written authorization of the current Duke of Aldenmere or his appointed representative. Clara read that again. Sealed by the late Duke per his instruction. He had sealed it himself. He had placed a restriction on it before he died that required ducal authorization to lift. She leaned back in her chair and thought about that. The late Duke who had sealed that box in 1923 was the Duke who would have been the beneficiary of the 1887 land transfer, the Duke who had built the Harrington estate's wealth and holdings in the period when Harenfield was acquired, the Duke who had, if her theory was correct, commissioned, or at least accepted, a forged document to legitimize a property that his family had taken by other means. He had sealed the box. He had put it in a public archive, where it would be formally catalogued and stored, but he had made it accessible only to his own descendants. Why would a man put a box of unknown contents in a public institution, rather than in his own private vault? Because a private vault could be searched, could be found, could be opened by authorities, in the event of an investigation. But a box in a public archive, formally donated, formally registered, formally restricted, that was untouchable. Protected by archival access rules, secure in plain sight. She closed the folder. She sat very still for a moment, her hands flat on her desk. She needed to access that box. To do so, she needed the written authorization of the current Duke of Aldenmere. The man who had stood next to her in a ballroom 24 hours ago and told his companion that she was nobody important. She thought, I am going to have to talk to him then. She was not sure yet how to do that. She was a staff archivist. She did not have the standing to request a private audience with a duke. She could not simply walk to the palace and ask to speak to him. There were channels and procedures, and levels of institutional formality that sat between her and him like walls. She could go through the institution. She could submit a formal research access request through the Archives Heritage Review Board, which would take a minimum of 8 weeks and would require her to disclose the nature of her research, which she was not prepared to do yet, not until she had more evidence. Because if she disclosed her theory now, without access to the box that might contain its proof, she had nothing but a theory, and a theory that accused a ducal family of historical fraud, made by an archivist who happened to be descended from the wronged family, would not be taken seriously. It would be dismissed. She would be dismissed. She could not let that happen. She needed the box first. The box and its contents. Then the theory became evidence. She needed a way to reach the Duke that did not go through the slow machinery of institutional process. She was still sitting with that problem, turning it over quietly in her mind, when Geoffrey came to stand at the edge of her desk with a second folder. "One more thing on the Harrington collection," he said. "This came up when I pulled the manifest. There was a supplementary note added to the accession record in 1967. She took the folder. Inside was a single photocopied page, a note in a different typeface from the 1923 manifest. It was dated May 12, 1967, and it was signed by the then archivist of the Royal Heritage Archive. Per direction of the Duke of Aldenmere, the following item from the 1923 Harrington donation is to be transferred from archive storage to palace vault storage, under archive custodial care. Sealed wooden box, item number 47, of the 1923 manifest. The item will remain under archive institutional custody, but will be housed in the Palace East Vault, accessible per the original terms of the donation." Clara looked up at Geoffrey. "The box is in the Palace Vault?" "Has been since 1967, he said. "Still under archive custody, technically, but physically, in the palace." She nodded slowly. She handed the folder back. After Geoffrey returned to his desk, she sat for a while longer. The box was in the Palace Vault. The palace where she had been standing last night. The palace where the Duke lived and worked. The palace where she had been dismissed in 5 words by the man whose authorization she now needed to open a sealed box that might contain proof of his family's oldest wrong. She thought about the invitation, the wax seal, the unsigned letter, the specific, deliberate placement of it inside the manuscript she had been working on. Someone had wanted her at that ball. Someone who knew she was investigating the deed. Someone who knew the box existed. Someone who wanted her to have access to something but could not, or would not give it to her directly. She opened the invitation again. She had brought it with her. She placed it on her desk and looked at the Harrington crest on the front. She looked at the letter inside. "Your presence is requested, in connection with matters pertaining to the Royal Archive collection." She had assumed that sentence meant the collection held here in the archive, but palace vaults were sometimes managed under archive protocols. The Royal Archive collection could refer to items housed in the palace. The box. Someone had sent her this invitation because of the box. She sat with that thought and let it settle into the place where she kept the things she was sure of. Then she reached for her notepad and her mechanical pencil and wrote a new name at the top of a fresh page. Duke Alden Harrington. She wrote beneath it, "Does not know. Does know and is complicit. Does know and is not complicit. Does not know yet." She studied the 4 possibilities. She had spent last night watching him across a room. She had stood within 3 feet of him twice. She had heard him speak, and seen him listen, and watched him perform warmth for his assembled guests. She had seen, in the moment before he announced his engagement, that his jaw was slightly too set, and his pace slightly too deliberate. She was good at reading things. She had always been good at reading things. And what she had read in him was not a man comfortable with everything he was doing. That was not evidence. It was observation. It was the kind of thing that could mean a great deal, or nothing at all. She did not put it in the evidence column. She kept it in the observation column, where it sat next to everything else she had noticed and not yet used. She wrote, "Find a way to reach him, not through channels. Directly." She underlined the word directly. She had the invitation. She had his family crest on paper she was holding in her own hand. She had a sealed box in a palace vault that fell under archive custody, which meant that technically As the archivist responsible for the Harrington collection, she had standing to request an appointment to discuss the custodial status of collection items held off-site. It was a thin thread, but thin threads, handled carefully, had a way of holding. She picked up her phone and called the palace administrative office. The phone rang 4 times. A woman answered with the formal efficiency of someone who managed very many calls, from very many people, who believed their reason for calling was the most important one. Clara gave her name and title. She said she was the senior archivist responsible for the Harrington family collection, and that she needed to arrange an appointment to discuss the custodial status of archive items currently housed in the palace vault. There was a brief pause on the other end. Not a dismissive pause, an evaluating one. "I'll note your request," the woman said. "Someone from the Duke's office will be in contact." "Thank you," Clara said. She put the phone down. She did not know if it would work. She had no way to know that. She had only done the thing that was available to her, and done it as precisely as she could. She went back to her work. She had 2 manuscripts to check, a catalog update to complete, and a training session to run for the 2 new junior archivists who had started last month. She did all of it with the focused attention she brought to everything, because the work was real, and it mattered, and the fact that there was a larger problem sitting in her mind did not change the value of the smaller work in front of her. At 4 in the afternoon, her desk phone rang. She answered it. "Miss Whitmore?" said a male voice. Well-spoken, efficient. Not the Duke himself, but the voice of someone who worked very close to him. "This is Edmund Castle, personal secretary to the Duke of Aldenmere. His Grace has received your inquiry regarding the archive custodial items." "Yes," she said. "He will see you at the palace tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, said the voice. "Please bring your archive credentials and the relevant accession documentation." "I will," she said. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." The call ended. Clara set the phone down and looked at her desk, at the folder with the manifest, at her notepad with the list of names, at the invitation with the Harrington crest. She was going to walk into that palace tomorrow and sit across a table from the man who had dismissed her in a room full of people. And she was going to do it with archive documentation in her hands and the precise, steady knowledge of what she was looking for. She was going to do it, and she was going to do it well, because she had spent her entire professional life learning how to handle fragile, important things without letting them fall apart. The Duke of Aldenmere had no idea what was sitting in his family's vault. And tomorrow, neither would she, not yet. But they were going to find out together, one way or another. The palace in the morning was a different thing from the palace at night. Clara arrived at 8:50, which meant she had walked the last 3 streets to ensure she would not be even a single minute late. The main gates were open, but not ornamental. A staff member at the side entrance checked her credentials against a list without ceremony and directed her through a marble lobby that was lit by plain morning light rather than chandelier warmth, which made it feel like what it actually was, a very large, very old building in which people also happened to work. She was shown to a waiting room on the 2nd floor. High ceilings, 3 chairs in pale fabric, a window overlooking the east garden, a painting on the wall of the kind she had catalogued in her sleep. She sat in the middle chair and put her bag on the floor beside her and placed her folder of accession documentation on her lap. She had dressed carefully that morning in her best professional clothes, which were good but not new, a dark gray jacket, a white shirt, plain trousers. She looked like what she was. She had not attempted to look like anything else. At precisely 9, a door opened and Edmund Cassell appeared. He was a compact, alert man of around 45, with the organized manner of someone who had spent his career managing details so that other people didn't have to think about them. He shook her hand efficiently and said, "His Grace will see you now." He led her through the door and down a short corridor, and through another door into a room that was neither a formal office nor a sitting room but something in between. A wide desk on one side, bookshelves, 2 chairs across from each other near the window, a fire that had been recently lit. The room smelled of old paper and wood smoke, which Clara noted was not an unpleasant combination. Duke Alden Harrington was standing at the bookshelf. He turned when she entered. He was, in the morning, in less formal clothes than the night before. A dark jacket, a pressed shirt, no decoration. He looked the way people look when they have been awake since early and are already in the middle of a day. He looked, in fact, slightly more like a person and slightly less like a portrait. He gestured toward the 2 chairs by the window. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "please sit." She sat. He sat across from her and did not do the thing that some powerful people did, the thing of making you wait while they looked at a document or consulted a phone to establish that you were coming to them, rather than meeting them equally. He simply sat and looked at her directly. She had not expected that. She looked back at him with the same directness and held it without letting anything complicated come through her expression. "You manage the Harrington collection," he said. It was not a question. "I do," she said. "I have been the primary archivist for the collection for 3 years. Before that, I assisted in the restoration of several items in the collection, specifically, the early 19th century correspondence." "And you're here about the box," he said. This was also not a question, and it surprised her enough that she took a fraction of a second longer than she should have to respond. She noticed that he noticed. "I'm here about the custodial status of items from the 1923 donation that were transferred to Palace Storage in 1967, she said carefully, including the sealed box designated as Item 47 of the donation manifest. "The box my grandfather sealed," he said. "Your great-grandfather," she said. "The 3rd Duke." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, slowly. "My great-grandfather," he agreed. "Yes." He reached across to the side table beside his chair and picked up a cup of tea. He offered her one, with a brief gesture, toward a second cup on the tray. She accepted, because declining felt unnecessarily formal, and she needed something to do with her hands. He poured. She took the cup. They sat for a moment in silence, which felt less like awkwardness and more like 2 careful people deciding how honest to be. "I should say something," he said then, and the directness of it caught her off guard again. She waited. "Last night," he said, "at the ball, I said something about you to a guest that was not appropriate." He paused. She watched his face. It was controlled but not closed, not performing the way it had been in the ballroom. "I said you were nobody important. I didn't consider whether you could hear it." "I heard it," she said. "I know," he said. "I realized afterward. I want to tell you it was poorly said, not just because you heard it, but because it was the wrong thing to say about any person." Clara looked at him. She was a person who weighed words very carefully, who knew the difference between an apology that was offered to clear the giver's discomfort and one that was offered because the giver understood what they had done wrong. She listened to his words and checked them against his face. He was not performing. He was not comfortable saying it. He said it anyway. "Thank you," she said. She kept her voice neutral, because the truth was more complicated than either anger or easy forgiveness, and the truth was what she dealt in. He set his cup down. "Tell me what you've found," he said. It was the sentence of someone who already knew there was something to find. Clara looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You didn't come here only about the box," he said. "And you didn't call the administrative office on a routine matter. You have something." He looked at her steadily. "I've had my secretary pull your professional record since last night. You are the most highly credentialed archivist on our staff. You specialize in forensic document analysis. You have been the sole archivist responsible for the 1923 Harrington collection for 3 years, which means you have had 3 years of direct access to every item in that collection, except the sealed box." He paused. "And you came to my ball." "I was invited," she said. "Yes," he said. "I didn't invite you." She said nothing. "My secretary checked the invitation list. Your name was added to it 10 days ago, by a Palace staff member who has since resigned and cannot be reached." Clara's grip on her teacup tightened very slightly. She kept it from showing. "Someone who worked here placed that invitation in the manuscript I was restoring," she said. "Apparently," he said. "Which means someone who worked here knew you were investigating something related to the collection, and wanted you at the ball. And wanted me to know you were there." She considered this. "Or wanted us to encounter each other." "Yes," he said. They looked at each other across the small distance between the 2 chairs, and Clara thought, he has been thinking about this too. Since last night. He has been awake since last night thinking about exactly this. She opened her folder. She placed the 1923 donation manifest on the small table between them. along with her own research notes and the photographed document images she had printed that morning. She laid them out neatly. She did not rush. 3 months ago, she said, I was cataloging an older section of the Harrington collection. I found a land deed dated 1887, a transfer of an estate called Harrenfield from a private family to the Harrington estate. He looked at the printed image of the deed. His face did not change. I analyzed the ink, she said. The document uses iron gall ink on paper that is genuinely from the period, but the ink composition is not consistent with natural aging from the 1880s. It has been artificially treated to appear oxidized. The registry seal in the lower corner was pressed, using a cutter that was not manufactured until the 1940s. She placed the image of her ink analysis beside the deed image. This is a forgery. He looked at the analysis. He looked at it for a long time. You're certain, he said. Yes, she said. I have the original document. The analysis was done by me and can be independently replicated by any qualified forensic archivist. He was quiet. The beneficiary of the forged deed, she said, is the Harrington estate. The Harrenfield property was small, but legitimate. Its original ownership before the 1887 transfer was held by a family whose old spelling of the name was Whitmore. She paused. My family's name was Whitmore. The old spelling, used in church records up until 1843, was Whitmore. He turned his head slightly toward her. Not sharply, not with surprise, exactly. With the look of a man who has been working toward a sentence and has now heard it spoken aloud for the first time. You are a descendant of the original Harrenfield family, he said. I believe so, she said. I cannot yet confirm it with complete documentary evidence, because the most relevant documents may be in the sealed box. But yes, I believe my family's estate was taken from them using a document that was forged, at some point between 1887 and whenever the Harrington donation was assembled in 1923. He leaned back in his chair. She watched him. She was watching for denial, for the shift into institutional protection that powerful people sometimes performed without even deciding to do it, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the reach for a phone, the polite end to the conversation. He did not do any of those things. He sat back, and he looked at the ceiling for a moment, and he let out a long, slow breath. 2 years ago, he said, still looking at the ceiling, I found something in the estate account ledgers from the late 1880s, a reference to a payment categorized as settlement of the Harrenfield matter. There was no corresponding record of any legal proceeding, no record of any court settlement, just the payment, listed in the accounts, and my father's handwriting in the margin of the page beside it, which said, Old business, closed. Clara set down her teacup very carefully. You knew, she said. I suspected, he said. He looked at her now. I did not know what I was suspecting. I found an irregularity, and I flagged it to my father, and my father told me it was a clerical error from a century ago, and not to pursue it. He paused, and I chose to believe him. Why? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because I was 32, and I had just taken on the estate, and I was told by the person I trusted most that it was nothing. And because some part of me understood that pulling on that thread might unravel something I wasn't ready to face. Clara looked at him. She understood that. She understood it more than she wanted to. What are you ready to face now? She asked. He looked at her directly. There was no performance in his face now. There was the look of a person who had been carrying something at a wrong angle and had just been shown how to shift the weight. Whatever is in that box, he said. She nodded. She reached into her folder and produced the formal archive access request she had drafted that morning, a request for authorization to access the sealed item number 47 from the 1923 Harrington donation for the purpose of archive collection review and conservation assessment. She placed it on the table in front of him. I'll need your written authorization, she said. He picked up a pen from his breast pocket and signed the document without pausing to read the formal language first. She noted that. He trusted what she had put in front of him. He handed it back. When? He said. I can arrange access as soon as the Palace Vault administrator confirms the appointment, she said. 3 to 5 days, given the security protocol requirements. I'll have Cassell expedite it, he said. 2 days. She nodded. She gathered her documents back into the folder with careful hands. Miss Whitmore, he said, as she prepared to stand. She looked at him. "The things I said last night," he said, "about the painting. The light in the landscape, the shadows being wrong." She waited. "That landscape is a painting of Heronfield," he said. She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "I recognized it." He looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, exactly, not shame. Something more careful than either. The look of a man who was beginning to understand the full shape of something he had only seen parts of before. "2 days," he said again. She stood and picked up her bag and her folder. 2 days, she agreed. She walked to the door. Edmund Cassell was waiting in the corridor to show her out. She followed him through the halls of the palace, through the lobby, through the side entrance, into the morning. She stood on the palace path in the clear light. She had just sat across from the Duke of Aldenmere and told him that his family had stolen her family's land. She had said it with documentation. She had said it calmly. He had signed the authorization form. She had not bowed her head once. She began walking toward the street. Above the palace, the sky was a clean, even blue, with a few light clouds moving across it from the west. The kind of sky that made you feel that the day was capable of holding whatever was asked of it. She had 2 days to wait. She had waited longer than this, much longer than this. She put her folder under her arm and walked into the morning. The 2 days were not idle ones. Clara did not allow herself idle time when she was in the middle of something. Idle time was where certainty frayed. She had learned that about herself a long time ago. She was better when she was moving, even if the movement was small and incremental and invisible to anyone watching. She went back to the archive the same morning after her meeting at the palace. She checked in with Geoffrey. She completed her outstanding cataloging work. She ran the scheduled training session for the 2 junior archivists, covering the basics of document condition assessment, which she taught in the straightforward way she had been taught, without shortcuts or ceremony, because shortcuts in this work had consequences that lasted longer than the shortcuts saved. In the afternoons, she reviewed her research notes and built the formal written framework for her forensic analysis of the deed. She was constructing an argument, which was not different from any other kind of archival work. An argument that a document was not what it appeared to be, supported by evidence that could be checked and checked again, and would hold up every time it was checked, because evidence either held up or it didn't, and hers did. She also, in the evenings, sat with the old box of papers her father had left. She had not opened it in over a year. Since the night of the ball, she had found herself thinking about it differently. Not as a collection of grief, but as a collection of evidence she had not yet fully processed. She went through it carefully, with white cotton gloves and a good lamp, the same way she would handle any archival material. The 3 letters in old handwriting she had never been able to read turned out, now that she brought a proper magnifying glass and her trained eye to them, to be correspondence between 2 men, one of whom signed himself W. Whitmore, and one of whom appeared to be a solicitor. The letters were from the early 1880s. They discussed, in the oblique legal language of the period, a land matter, a dispute over rights, a question of original documentation. Someone had been questioning the documentation around the Heronfield estate even before 1887. She photographed each letter carefully. She noted the dates, the phrasing, the specific legal terms used. She added them to her research file. On the second evening, her phone rang. She answered it, expecting Geoffrey or possibly someone from the palace administrative office with a scheduling update. It was Harriet Lowe. Clara was surprised. She had not expected to hear from her. She had not given Harriet her number. Harriet explained, slightly awkwardly, that she had asked her father's contact at the Heritage Conservation Board, who had looked it up from the archive's contact directory. She apologized for reaching out this way. She said she would understand if Clara would rather she didn't call. Clara said she didn't mind. Harriet said, "I heard something from my father today that I thought you should know." Clara straightened in her chair. "Go on," she said. Harriet said, "The Duke's engagement has been called off. Lady Serena and he have separated, as of this morning. My father heard it from someone on the board, who is close to the Ashford family. I don't know if it's relevant to you. I just thought, after what I witnessed the other night, that you might want to know." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Why would you think it's relevant to me?" she asked. "Because," Harriet said, and then paused in the way people pause when they are deciding how perceptive to sound. The way he looked when he crossed the room to speak to you at the gallery, after the announcement, was not the way a man who has just announced an engagement looks at a person who means nothing to him. Clara said nothing. I could be entirely wrong, Harriet added. You might be, Clara said. But thank you for telling me. She put the phone down and looked at the letters on her desk. She was not going to think about that. She was not going to add it to any of the columns in her notes. It was a piece of information that did not fit cleanly into the evidence framework, and she had made a rule a long time ago about keeping personal observations separate from professional investigation until the professional investigation was complete. She went back to the letters, but she thought about it anyway, in the background where she kept the things she was not ready to examine directly, the way you keep a lamp lit in an adjacent room when you're working in the dark, not looking at it, knowing it's there. On the morning of the second day, Cassell called. The vault access has been arranged, he said. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. The Duke will be present. I'll be there, she said. She put down the phone and sat at her desk for a moment, with her hands still. Tomorrow. She would open the box tomorrow. She had spent 3 months thinking about what might be in it. She had spent 4 years thinking about what had been taken from her family. She had spent her entire professional life learning how to find the truth inside old, closed, difficult things. Tomorrow morning, she was going to put her hands on a box that had been sealed for 100 years by a man who had done something wrong and wanted no one to be able to prove it. She thought about her father, about the note she still kept in her memory. Someone should know. She thought, I know, Dad. I'm going to make sure everyone else does too. She turned off her desk lamp. She put on her coat. She walked out of the archive and into the evening, which was dark and cool and perfectly quiet, the way evenings are just before something changes. She had one more night of not knowing. She intended to use it well. The palace vault was underground. Clara had known this from the architectural records in the archive, where the original palace blueprints were stored in a flat file drawer, rolled and sleeved in protective cotton. She had catalogued them herself 2 years ago. She knew the vault had been constructed in the late 1800s, reinforced and expanded in the 1950s, and was accessed through a staircase behind a locked door in the palace basement. She had not expected to feel the change in the air so immediately when she descended the stairs. The temperature dropped noticeably. The light shifted from the warm tones of the upper floors to the flat, even light of fluorescent fixtures mounted along the ceiling of a corridor that ran 40 feet before reaching the vault door. The vault door was steel, painted dark gray, with a digital access panel beside it. Cassell handled the panel. He did not invite Clara or the Duke to watch him enter the code, which was professional practice. He stepped aside when the door gave a short mechanical sound and swung open on a quiet pivot. Inside was a room of perhaps 20 feet by 15, with metal shelving units along 3 walls and a central table, plain and functional. The shelving held a variety of items in protective containers, labeled boxes, sealed tubes for rolled documents, metal deed boxes with registry numbers on the fronts. Everything was ordered and clean. A small climate control unit hummed in the upper right corner. The Duke stood at Clara's left shoulder. Cassell remained by the door. Clara looked at the shelving and began reading the label numbers. She had memorized the archive item number, 47, from the 1923 Harrington donation, transferred to palace custody 1967. She moved along the second shelf from the left. She found it. It was smaller than she had imagined, perhaps 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 5 inches deep. Made of dark polished wood, the kind used for presentation boxes in the early 20th century. The brass clasp on the front had been pressed shut, and then a thin strip of wax had been run along the edge of the lid, sealing it. The wax was old and dark, brittle at the edges, but unbroken. A small archive label had been added on the outside, paper over card, handwritten in faded ink. Item 47, Harrington Collection, 1923. Do not open without ducal authorization. Clara set her document bag on the central table and opened it. She took out her white archival gloves and put them on. She took out her camera, a small professional-grade model she used for document photography, and set it on the table. She took out a thin spatula tool used for opening sealed materials without damaging the contents. She picked up the box and placed it on the table. The Duke had not said anything since they came down the stairs. He stood 2 feet to her right, watching. She was aware of him, the way you are aware of a person in a small room. Not intrusively, just present, taking up space and temperature. "I'm going to photograph the box before I open it," she said, "and everything that comes out of it." "All right," he said. She photographed the box on all sides. She photographed the clasp. She photographed the wax seal from 2 angles. Then she picked up the spatula tool. The wax broke along its edge with a small, dry crack. She worked carefully along the entire seal before attempting to lift the lid. When the wax was free, she set the tool down and lifted the lid with 2 hands, holding it at the edges. Inside, a layer of old cotton wool, yellowed but intact, protected whatever was beneath. She lifted the cotton wool in one careful piece and set it aside. Inside the box were documents. 4 of them, folded and stacked. She counted them with her eyes before touching them. 4 documents, folded in thirds in the old manner, with additional folded letters tucked between them. She could see the edges. On top of the stack, facing up, was a single piece of card, handwritten, the ink brown with age. She read it. "This box contains documentation relating to the acquisition of the Herrenfield property by the Aldenmere estate, 1887. These documents represent the original proceedings and are sealed by order of the Duke of Aldenmere for the preservation of the estate and the protection of its future interests. They are not to be opened, except by the reigning Duke. God grant him wisdom." It was signed, William Harrington, Duke of Aldenmere, December 1922. She photographed the card. She heard the Duke breathe in slowly beside her. She set the card aside and lifted the first document from the stack. She unfolded it with steady hands and laid it flat on the table. It was a letter, not a forged one. She could tell immediately from the ink oxidation, the paper texture, the way the handwriting moved across the page. This was genuinely old. She read the date at the top, March 14th, 1885. The letter was addressed to William Harrington, at the Aldenmere estate. The opening line read, "I write to you again on the matter of the Herrenfield property, which as you know my family has held for 3 generations, and which you have indicated an interest in acquiring." The signature at the bottom was clear and complete. George Whitmore. Her great-great-grandfather. She read the letter. Her eyes moved over it in the careful, methodical way she had trained herself to read old documents, not too fast, not skipping, taking in each line. The letter was a refusal. George Whitmore was declining, clearly and firmly, to sell the Herrenfield property to William Harrington. He said the property was not for sale. He said it was his family's home. He said the offer, however generous, was not something he could accept. She photographed the letter. She set it aside. The second document was another letter, dated June 1886, from George Whitmore, to a solicitor named Clarence Marsh. She read it. Whitmore was reporting an incident. Men had come to the Herrenfield estate, claiming that William Harrington had rights over the property, based on a document they could not produce. Whitmore was asking his solicitor to clarify the legal position. The letter was alarmed in tone but still controlled, not the tone of a man who expected to lose, the tone of a man who was certain he was right and expected the law to confirm it. She photographed it. Third document. A legal notice dated January 1887, headed with the name of a law firm. It notified George Whitmore that under the terms of a land transfer deed dated December 1887, the Herrenfield property had been transferred to the Aldenmere estate. It invited him to vacate within 60 days. December 1887. The deed, the forged deed, made to appear historical but created later, possibly much later, using period paper and artificially aged ink. She photographed the notice. She looked at the date of the notice again, January 1887. But the deed itself was dated December 1887. 11 months later. That meant the legal notice was dated before the deed itself. That was not possible. A notice of transfer could not precede the deed by 11 months. Someone had made a mistake. She looked again. She checked the year on each document. The letter was March 1885. The refusal. The legal notice was January 1887. The deed was December 1887. If the notice came in January and the deed was December of the same year, the notice came before the deed by 11 months. She set the documents side by side. She picked up her camera and took 3 photographs of the 2 documents together, clearly showing both dates in the same frame. She straightened. "Your Grace," she said. He stepped closer. He had been watching her work without interrupting, which she had noted and appreciated. He looked at the documents laid out on the table. She pointed to the dates. She explained what she had found. She kept her voice even and clear, the way she would explain a finding to a senior colleague. He looked at the documents. He looked at both dates. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The notice came before the deed. By 11 months, she said. Which means," he began. "It means the deed cannot be the original instrument of transfer," she said. "The legal process was already in motion before the deed existed. The deed was created afterward, to provide a documentary basis for a process that had already been completed by other means. Possibly by pressure. Possibly by legal maneuvering, using documents that no longer exist. But the deed itself was not the starting point. It was a cover made later, to replace whatever was actually done." He was silent. "And the cover was imperfect," she said. "The dates don't match." "A mistake," he said. "A mistake," she agreed. "The kind of mistake that happens when someone is constructing a false history and loses track of the real timeline." She picked up the fourth document from the box. It was also a letter, but it was not old. The paper was white, and the ink was modern. It was typed, not handwritten. It was dated 11 months ago. She read it. It was addressed to Duke Alden Harrington. It was signed by a man named Oliver Crane, whom she did not recognize. The letter told him, in careful and measured language, that the writer had become aware of irregularities in the 1887 Harenfield land transfer and believed the original deed in the Royal Heritage Archive was not authentic. It said the writer had done preliminary research but lacked the technical expertise to take it further. It said the writer had placed the letter in the sealed vault box, which he had been given access to in his capacity as a member of the palace staff, in the hope that it would reach the Duke and lead to a proper investigation. It said, "The rightful family may still exist. I believe they do. If so, they deserve to know." The letter had never reached the Duke. It had been placed in the box in the vault, and the box was sealed, and nobody had told the Duke it was there. Clara looked up. She looked at Cassel, who was still standing by the door. Cassell's face had gone the particular neutral color of a man who has just understood that something he thought was contained was not. "Edmund Cassel," the Duke said, his voice very quiet. "Who placed a letter in this box 11 months ago?" Cassel was quiet for a moment, that went on too long. "Oliver Crane," Cassel said finally. "He was a member of the Palace Archival Liaison staff. He resigned 3 weeks ago." "He resigned before my ball," Clara said. "Before the invitation appeared in my manuscript." "He placed the invitation," Cassel said. "I discovered it after the fact. He had access to the restricted manuscript storage through his liaison role." He paused. "He came to me when he found the letter in the box. He came to me before he resigned. He told me what he had found. I advised him that the matter needed to be handled through proper channels, and that I would take it to the Duke." "You didn't," the Duke said. Cassel looked at him. "I was protecting the estate." "Protecting the estate," the Duke said, and his voice was still quiet, but the quality of the quiet had changed entirely. "A man brought you proof that our family had wronged another family, and you said nothing. I said I would handle it through proper channels. You did nothing," the Duke said. Cassel said nothing. Clara carefully photographed the modern letter. She placed all 4 documents and the card back in the box, in the order she had found them. She closed the lid. She labeled her camera card with the date and case reference. She was aware, on one level, of the conversation happening 2 feet away from her, of the Duke's voice remaining controlled but tight at the edges, of Cassel's explanations becoming shorter as they became less defensible. She kept her hands busy and her breathing steady, and she processed what she had found, with the part of her mind that was always running, the part that turned evidence into understanding. Oliver Crane had found the truth. He had put a letter in the box hoping to reach the Duke. The Duke had not been told. A palace staff member had suppressed the information, and Oliver Crane, finding no action taken through official channels, had gone outside those channels entirely. He had placed the invitation in her manuscript. He had made sure she came to the ball. He had made sure she and the Duke were in the same room. A man she had never met had trusted her to do what he could not. She straightened and looked at Castle. "I'll need to speak with Oliver Crane," she said. "Can you provide his contact information?" "I can get it," Castle said. His voice had the flat quality of a man who was no longer certain which side of this situation was going to be better to be on. "Please do," she said. Then she looked at the Duke. He met her eyes. There was something in his face that she had not seen before. Not shame, exactly, because the wrong was not his, but the look of a man who had just watched the thing he told himself wasn't there turn out to be exactly where he had been trying not to look. "What happens now?" he asked. She picked up her bag. She picked up her camera. She checked that the accession documents were in her folder. "Now," she said, "I write the report." She did not write the report that afternoon. She went back to the archive first, because there was one more piece she needed before the report could be complete. She needed the forged deed. She signed it out of the secure storage room herself, using her credentials, writing the reason in the log as forensic reassessment, ongoing investigation. She carried it to her workstation and placed it on the examination mat under the proper lighting. She looked at it. She had looked at it many times in the past 3 months, but this was the first time she looked at it knowing what she now knew, that the deed had not been the starting point, but the end point of a wrong, that the wrong had been done first, through pressure or manipulation, or means she still did not fully understand, and then covered over with this document, carefully constructed to look as though it had always existed. She looked at the ink. Wrong, but close. She looked at the seal. Accurate for the period, but pressed with a tool that had not existed then. She looked at the legal phrasing, borrowed from a genuine letter stored in the gallery upstairs, a real document used as a template for a false one. She looked at the name of the transferring party, Whitmore. She thought about her great-great-grandfather writing a letter in 1885 saying, "This property is not for sale. It is my family's home." He had written that, and then 2 years later he had been told, by a legal notice that preceded the deed that supposedly authorized it, that it had already been transferred, that the paper said it was done. She thought about what that must have felt like, to be told that a piece of paper had ended something you had refused to surrender. She photographed the deed one more time, this time with the date-bearing documents from the vault laid beside it in the frame, showing all 3 dates together. The letter, 1885, the notice, January 1887, the deed, December 1887. She emailed the photographs to her own archive account, backed them up to the secure drive, and noted the time and date of each action in her investigation log. She spent the evening writing. Not the formal report yet. The formal report would come later, when she had spoken to Oliver Crane and confirmed the chain of events that had led to the invitation being placed in her manuscript. She needed his account before the report was complete. But she could begin the structural argument, the framework of what the evidence showed, the sequence of documents, the forensic analysis, the historical timeline, the nature and extent of the discrepancy between the false record and the true one. She wrote for 4 hours. She wrote clearly and precisely, in plain language that could be understood by any educated reader. Technical terms where they were necessary, but explained in the text rather than assumed. She was writing for the Heritage Review Commission, which included members who were not archivists, who were historians and lawyers and civil servants, and she wanted every single one of them to follow her exactly. Around 11 that night she stopped and made tea, and sat at her kitchen window looking out at the dark street below. She thought about a conversation she had had with her father when she was 17. He had been explaining to her why he had become interested in history as a young man, not as a career, but as a habit of mind. He had said that he believed every present wrong had a past record somewhere, if you were willing to look back far enough. That people left traces of themselves in documents, whether they meant to or not. That truth was not always obvious, but it was almost always findable, by someone patient enough to look. She had chosen archival work partly because of that conversation. She had chosen forensic document analysis because she was very good at it, and because it was rare, and because it meant she could do the kind of looking her father had described, the slow, careful, complete looking, and call it her profession. She had not known, when she chose it, that it would lead her here. To a box in a vault, to a sealed note from a stranger named Oliver Crane, to a date on a legal notice that could not be reconciled with a date on a deed. To the name Whitmore, written in a forgery, and Whitmore, written in a genuine old letter, and the full shape of 100-year-old wrong beginning to come clear. She finished her tea. She went back to the desk and wrote for another hour. She would call Oliver Crane tomorrow. She would finish the report by the end of the week. She would submit it to the Heritage Review Commission through the formal process, with full documentation, with the photographs, and the analysis, and the chain of custody, and the account of the vault opening, and everything that had happened. She would do all of it correctly, completely, without shortcuts. Because shortcuts had consequences that lasted too long. She thought of the Duke, standing in the vault, watching her work, signing the authorization without reading the fine print because he trusted what she had put in front of him. She thought, he is going to have to face what is in this report. His family name is going to be in it. His great-grandfather's wrong is going to be on the public record. She thought about whether he understood that when he signed the form. She thought he probably did. She thought that was not a small thing about him. She turned off the lamp. She slept better that night than she had in 3 months. Tomorrow the truth would start moving. And once truth started moving, in her experience, it did not stop until it had gone all the way. Oliver Crane was not difficult to find. He had not gone far. He lived in a flat on the east side of the city, in a building that was modest and slightly worn at the edges, the kind of building that housed people who were in the middle of figuring out what came next. Clara had called the number Cassell had provided the morning after the vault visit. Crane had answered on the second ring, which told her he had been expecting a call of some kind. Perhaps not hers specifically, but some kind of call. She had introduced herself. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "You opened the box." "Yes," she said. Another pause. "How much do you know?" "Enough," she said, "but I need to hear it from you. The invitation. How you placed it. Why?" He had agreed to meet her the following afternoon, in a small cafe, 3 streets from his flat. She arrived first and chose a table near the back where they could speak without being overheard. She ordered tea and sat with her notepad open, but her pencil down. Oliver Crane arrived at the time he had said he would. He was younger than she had imagined from his letter, perhaps 30, with the slightly worn look of someone who had recently gone through something that had cost them. Not dramatically, just the way difficult months cost people, in the set of the eyes, the quality of the attention. He sat down. He ordered coffee. He looked at her. "You're the archivist," he said. "I am," she said. "The letter in the box was the last thing I could think of," he said. "I had tried everything else. I went to Cassell. He told me he would handle it. I waited 2 months. Nothing happened. I thought about going to the Duke directly, but I didn't have the standing to request a direct meeting, and I was worried that if I tried through normal channels, Cassell would intercept it. He was careful about access to the Duke's communications." "So you resigned," she said. "I couldn't stay," he said. "Once I knew what I knew, I couldn't keep working in that building. It felt wrong. But before I left, I put the letter in the box. I knew only the Duke had authorization to open it, and I thought, if something ever came up that required accessing the Harrington collection, someone would have to go to the Duke for authorization, and then he would open the box and find the letter." He paused. It was a long shot. "And the invitation?" she said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I had been tracking who was working on the Harrington archive collection," he said. "In my role as liaison, I had access to the work logs. I saw your name on the forensic assessment for the deed 3 months before I resigned. I didn't have the expertise to understand your findings, but I could see from the log that you had flagged the deed for extended analysis, which was unusual for a routine deed of that period. You knew I had found something," she said. "I suspected," he said, "and I knew your name from your publications. I had read your paper on ink oxidation analysis in the Journal of Heritage Conservation. I understood you were exactly the kind of person who would know what the deed was." She looked at him. "The invitation was in the manuscript I was working on. The restricted manuscript room. You had access?" "As liaison, I could accompany senior staff to the restricted room," he said. "I went in with a senior archivist 2 days before I resigned, to accompany them on a collection check. I placed the invitation in the manuscript while they were reviewing a different section of the room." She thought about the timing. He had been planning his departure carefully, covering as many angles as he could before he left. You took a considerable risk, she said. I took the only option I could see, he said. The letter in the box was the official route. The invitation was the backup. He looked at her steadily. I couldn't let it go. I'm not an archivist. I don't have your training. But I found something wrong, and I felt it in my bones. The kind of wrong that doesn't go away if you look the other direction. I didn't have the tools to fix it. I hoped you did. Clara looked at him for a moment. You knew about the Whitmore family? She asked. He nodded. Not at first. When I found the box and read the card on top, I started researching the Heronfield transfer. I found references to the Whitmore family in the original deed, the old spelling. I cross-referenced it with public genealogical records. He paused. I found your father's obituary. I found your name. She absorbed that. Someone had done all of this for a family he had no connection to, for a wrong he had stumbled on by accident, because it felt like a wrong that needed someone to pay attention to it. He had paid attention, with everything available to him. And when those options ran out, he had placed his hope in a stranger he had researched only on paper. Why? She asked. Why did it matter enough to you personally? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. My mother's family lost their home in a legal dispute when I was 12, he said. Paperwork dispute. A contract that the other party said didn't mean what my grandfather said it meant. He could never get anyone to take it seriously. He spent the rest of his life believing the paperwork was wrong and that nothing could be done about it. He looked up. I know that feeling of watching someone carry a wrong they can't put down. When I found the Heronfield documents, I thought, if I can do something about this one, I should. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said, I'm going to need a written statement from you. Everything you've told me, in the order it happened. Dates, actions, what you found and when, who you told and what they said. He nodded. I'll write it. It will be part of the formal submission to the Heritage Review Commission, she said. Your name will be on the record. All right, he said. Castle may contest your account, she said. He can try, Oliver Crane said with the quiet confidence of a man who had written his letter and kept copies of everything. She gathered her bag. She had what she needed. Thank you, she said. He shook his head. Don't thank me. Just finish it. She nodded. She left the cafe and walked into the afternoon, which was overcast and cool, the sky carrying the weight of coming rain. She did not mind rain. She walked in it sometimes when she needed to think, without any background noise except water. She thought, walking back toward the archive, about the chain of it. Her great-great-grandfather writing a letter in 1885, refusing to sell. Someone taking the estate anyway, and covering it badly. A sealed box with 100 years of wrong inside it. A young palace liaison worker who had done his best with what he had. An archivist who had spent 3 months knowing something was wrong, and another 2 days knowing exactly what it was. A thread that ran from 1885 to right now, this afternoon, her feet on wet stone, her bag over her shoulder, the photographs of the vault documents on her phone and in her camera, and backed up to 3 separate locations, because she had not survived this long as a careful person, by keeping important things in only one place. She went back to the archive. She spent the afternoon and much of the evening writing. She wrote the full forensic analysis of the deed, 12 pages of clear and precise argument, supported by the photographic evidence and the comparative analysis and the expert methodology. She wrote the historical timeline of the transfer, using the dated documents from the vault and the letters from her father's box. She wrote the chain of events that had led to the box being sealed in 1923 and the discovery of its contents now. She cited every source. She annotated every photograph. She wrote with the discipline of someone who understood that the document she was building was as much an act of restoration as anything she had ever done at a workbench with cotton gloves and a spatula tool. She was restoring a true account to the place where a false one had been allowed to stand for 100 years. When Jeffrey knocked on her office doorframe at 6 that evening and told her he was leaving, she looked up and realized she had been at her desk for 7 hours, without moving, except for tea. Go home, Clara, he said, in the slightly parental way that Jeffrey occasionally spoke when she was absorbed in something. Soon, she said. He gave her the look he gave when he knew soon meant another 2 hours, and left without pushing it, because he also knew that when Clara was in this mode, interrupting it did not help anyone. She wrote until 8. Then she stopped. Not because she had run out of energy, but because she had reached the point in the report where she needed Oliver Crane's written statement before she could continue. She had the structure. She had the argument. She had the evidence. She needed the human chain. Who had found what? Who had been told? What had been done and not done? She saved the file in 4 places. She put on her coat. She was almost at the door when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Duke Alden Harrington. She stood in the doorway of the archive, coat half on, phone in her hand. She answered it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was controlled, but she was beginning to be able to tell when his control was effortful. "I want to apologize for Castle." "It's not your apology to make," she said. "He works for my household," he said. "He suppressed information that directly harmed someone on the basis that he was protecting the estate. That happened under my name. I should have." He stopped. "I should have asked more questions 2 years ago when I found the ledger entry. If I had, Oliver Crane might never have needed to take the steps he took." She thought about whether to say the easy thing, the thing that let him off the hook. She decided not to. "You didn't know what you were dealing with," she said. "But you're right that the question should have been asked." A pause. "How is the report coming?" "I'll have a complete draft within the week," she said. "I need Oliver Crane's statement first. He's agreed to provide it." "Good," he said. Then, "I've released Castle from his duties. Effective today." She said nothing. She did not have a position on that yet. "I wanted you to know," he said, "in case it affected the investigation in any way. It doesn't change the evidence," she said, "but it does change the chain of accountability. His role will be part of the record regardless." "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to manage the record. I'm trying to manage the situation correctly. Those are different things." She stood in the doorway of her archive building. Outside, the street was quiet in the way it got at that hour. The evening crowd thinned, just a few people moving past under the streetlights. "There is something I need to tell you," he said, "about the gallery letter. The one in the 3rd frame of the Harrington donation display." She had been waiting for him to bring this up. "I had it removed this morning," he said. "From the frame. Properly, with a conservator. I didn't touch it." He paused. "When they took it out of the mounting, they could see the full name in the corner, the one the mat had been covering." "Whitmore," she said. "George Whitmore," he said. 1884. "It's a letter he sent to my family 2 years before the refusal letter you found in the vault. It's the first recorded contact between them on the subject of Heronfield." She closed her eyes for one moment. 1884. Her family had been in contact with his for 3 years before the estate was taken. 3 years of correspondence, of back and forth, of offers and refusals, of a slow campaign to acquire something that was not being offered. "That letter needs to be in the archive custody under the investigation protocols," she said. "The conservator has it," he said. "I'll arrange transfer to your office tomorrow." "Thank you," she said. A silence, short, but not empty. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "when this is over, when the report is submitted, and the process is underway, I would like to speak with you. Not about the investigation, about what comes after it." She thought about what comes after. She had not let herself think very far into that territory yet, because she had learned not to think too far ahead of the evidence. The evidence was the thing that mattered. The evidence came first. But she was aware, in a way she kept at the edge of her attention, rather than in the center of it, that after all of this, there would be a moment where what she and the Duke had built across 2 meetings and a phone call, and a vault, and a very significant box, was something she would have to decide what to do with. She was not ready for that yet. "Ask me when it's over," she said. "All right," he said. She said goodnight. She put the phone in her coat pocket. She walked out into the dark street and turned toward home. She thought about Oliver Crane, sitting in a small flat on the east side of the city, writing out his statement at whatever table he had, careful and honest and thorough, because that was the kind of person he was. She thought about George Whitmore, 1884, writing a letter to a man he did not trust, trying to protect something that was his. She thought about her father, in his armchair, holding a mug of tea, saying, "It was not sold, Clara. It was taken, but I could never prove it." She walked. The night was cold and clear. Stars above the city, dim through the light pollution but present. She thought, "You can prove it, Dad." She thought, "I'm going to prove it for you." 3 days after the vault visit, Oliver Crane delivered his written statement. He brought it in person to the archive, arriving at 9 in the morning, with a printed copy in a plain folder and a digital copy on a small drive. He handed both to Clara without ceremony. She thanked him. He looked at her office briefly, at the neat desk and the careful bookshelves and the framed letter from the archive's founding director that she kept on the wall because she liked the handwriting. "You'll be all right?" he asked, which was an odd thing to ask an archivist about a report, but she understood what he meant. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He shook her hand and left. She read the statement over her morning tea. It was 9 pages, organized chronologically, precise about dates, and specific about names and conversations. Oliver Crane was not a trained writer, but he had a disciplined mind, and the statement was clear in the way that mattered most. It was checkable. Everything in it could be cross-referenced against phone records, access logs, email trails, and the vault's own access history. Castle would be interviewed by the commission. His account would be measured against Crane's, against the access logs, against his own phone records from the period when Crane had reported the finding to him. The commission's investigators were very good at finding the places where accounts did not match the evidence. Clara had every confidence in the evidence. She added the statement to the report file. She was now 3 pages from finishing the main body of the report. She would need the full morning and perhaps the early afternoon. She put on her gloves and opened the file. She wrote. She wrote with the same focused precision she brought to every line of every analysis she had ever produced. She was not writing to persuade. She was not writing to condemn. She was writing to document, which was both simpler and harder than persuasion, because documentation required you to state only what the evidence actually showed and nothing beyond it, and to state it so clearly that the evidence spoke for itself. The evidence was very clear. A property had been taken in 1887 from a family named Whitmore, now Whitmore, by a process whose documentary basis was a forged deed created to replace a real transaction that had occurred by other means, as evidenced by the existence of a legal notice dated 11 months before the deed, written correspondence showing that the original family had refused to sell, and the absence of any authentic transfer instrument in the archive holdings. The sealed vault had contained additional correspondence confirming the original family's resistance to the transfer and the fraudulent nature of the legal proceedings that followed. She stated the conclusion. The Heronfield property was not legitimately acquired by the Aldenmere estate. The documentary basis for the acquisition was false. The living descendants of the original family were identifiable, and a formal heritage claim process should be initiated by the Royal Heritage Review Commission. She read those lines back to herself once. Then she moved on and wrote the final pages. She was done by early afternoon. She printed the report, 47 pages. She checked every page. She signed the cover page in her professional capacity as Senior Forensic Archivist, Royal Heritage Archive, and added the date. She placed it in a formal archive envelope with the photographs and the documentary evidence. She called the Heritage Review Commission and arranged a formal submission appointment for the following day. Then she sat back in her chair. She had done what she came to do, not just at the ball, not just in the 3 months of investigation, but what she had been working toward in the quiet accumulated years of everything she had learned and built and carried. Jeffrey knocked on her doorframe. "You finished it," he said. He could tell from her face. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, with the simple directness that she had always liked about him. He did not ask what it contained. He understood that it would become public through the proper processes, and that until it did, it was hers to manage. He just stood in the doorway for a moment, with the look of someone who was glad the work was done. "Go home at a reasonable time tonight," he said. "I will," she said. He believed her this time. He could tell, she supposed, that the urgency was different now. Not gone. Changed. The kind of settled that comes after you have done the thing you were meant to do. She looked at the envelope on her desk. 47 pages. 212 citations. Every piece of evidence she had gathered, organized, verified, and laid out in the plain, honest language of someone who understood that the truth did not need decoration. It only needed to be seen. Tomorrow, it would begin to be seen. She put on her coat. She turned off her lamp. She walked out of the archive, locking the door behind her as she always did, with the careful habit of someone who understood that the things inside were important, and worth protecting. She walked home through the early evening. The city was loud around her, in the comfortable way cities are at that hour, full of people moving between one part of their day and the next, going home, going out, carrying bags and conversations, and the ordinary weight of ordinary lives. She thought about her father's note. Someone should know. Someone would know. Everyone would. She turned onto her street. Above the bookshop, her window was dark. She had left her reading lamp on by the armchair, which she usually did, and she could see the faint warm edge of it through the curtain. She climbed the stairs. She made tea. She sat down. Tomorrow, the report would go to the commission. Then it would not be hers alone anymore. It would belong to the process, to the investigators, and the legal advisors, and the historians, and the public record that would eventually hold it. That was what she had wanted. That was what it was for. She sat in the lamplight, and she let herself rest. She had done the work. The truth was moving now. And once truth starts moving, it does not stop. The Heritage Review Commission met in a building that had been constructed to project authority without ostentation, which it did, with the quiet efficiency of old stone and high ceilings, and an entrance hall that made everyone who came through it feel that whatever they were bringing had better be serious. Clara had been in this building twice before, once to receive an award for a paper she had published, once to present findings on a collection of contested medieval documents that turned out, under her analysis, to be genuine. She knew the corridor that led to the main hearing chamber, and she walked it without needing to be guided. She was accompanied by Jeffrey, whom she had asked to come as her institutional representative. He had agreed without making it complicated. He walked beside her with the particular steadiness of a man who understood that his role was to be steady. She was also accompanied, and this had been arranged through a phone call 3 days before, and confirmed by a formal letter from the Duke's office, by Duke Alden Harrington. He had offered to attend when she had told him the submission date. She had told him that his presence was not required by the Commission's process, but that it would be noted, and that if he wished to make a voluntary statement, the Commission would accept it. He had said that he intended to make a statement, and that he would like to be present for the full submission. She had said, "All right." He was beside her now as they walked into the hearing chamber, which surprised a small number of people in the room. She could see it in the slight adjustment of posture among the commission members already seated at the long table, the minor recalibration of expectation. A duke attending a heritage investigation as a supporting witness rather than as a party being defended was not a common occurrence. The commission chair was a woman named Dr. Frances Webb, a historian of considerable reputation, and the particular authority of someone who had been asking hard questions professionally for 40 years, and had not been impressed by status since approximately 1990. She nodded at Clara with recognition, and at the Duke with the same professional neutrality she gave everyone. The session was formal. Clara presented the report. She walked the commission through the forensic analysis, the vault contents, the chain of documentary evidence, and Oliver Crane's written account. She answered questions. The commission members were thorough. They asked about methodology. They asked about chain of custody. They asked about the dating discrepancy between the legal notice and the deed, which she explained twice, and then a third time in response to a specific follow-up, because it was the technical heart of the argument, and she wanted everyone in the room to understand it without any doubt. The Duke made his voluntary statement when invited to do so. He was precise. He described finding the ledger entry 2 years ago, his conversation with his father, his decision not to pursue it, and his recognition, now, that it had been the wrong decision. He described authorizing access to the vault. He described his intentions going forward. He did not attempt to minimize what his family had done. He did not use the language of distance that people sometimes used when describing inherited wrongdoing, phrases like, actions of the time, or different standards then. He said, "My family took something that was not theirs, and built a false documentary record to make it appear legitimate. That was wrong. I intend to cooperate fully with whatever process this commission requires." Dr. Frances Webb wrote something on the paper in front of her. She was not a person whose expression told you much. But she wrote for several seconds, and Clara thought that was probably a good sign. After the formal session, there was a brief recess. Clara stood in the corridor outside the chamber, with Jeffrey, and a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been made several hours ago, but was warm, and she appreciated it. The Duke came to stand beside her in the corridor. He was in formal clothes but not the full ceremonial dress of the ball. He looked, she had noticed, like a man who had slept less than usual for several days, which was understandable given the circumstances, and who had arrived here having made a decision and was not going back on it. "You did well in there," Jeffrey said to Clara, because Jeffrey was not a man who withheld a straightforward compliment when one was due. "The evidence did the work," Clara said. Jeffrey made the noise he made when he didn't disagree, but thought she was underselling something. Then he said he was going to find a better cup of coffee, and walked away. The Duke looked at her. "How are you?" he asked. It was a simple question, but the way he asked it was not simple. It was the way of someone who was asking about the full weight of the morning, the full weight of the months that had preceded it, and possibly the full weight of discovering that the wrong done to your family was documented in a sealed box that had sat in a vault under a palace for 100 years. She considered the question. She was someone who answered questions honestly when she had thought about them. "Tired," she said, "and something else that I don't have a good word for yet." He nodded. "I know that feeling." She looked at him. He probably did know it. He had spent the past week sitting with the knowledge that his family's wealth and position rested in part on something that should never have been done, and he had chosen to face it rather than manage it. That had its own weight. "When you signed the authorization form," she said, "at that first meeting, you signed it without reading the formal language." "I know," he said. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her with the directness that she had come to recognize as simply how he was when he was not performing anything. "Because I had read everything I needed to read about you before you came to my office," he said. "Your professional history, your published work, the way your colleagues described your methodology." He paused. "I trusted that whatever you were about to find, you would handle it the right way." She said nothing for a moment. "That was a significant risk," she said. "Yes," he said. "It turned out to be the right one." She looked at the corridor wall, which was plain stone and mortar, very old and very solid. She thought about trust, about how it was assessed, about how rarely she gave it easily, and how, in this case, she had been given it from the other direction first, by a man she had every reason to distrust, based on character evidence assembled before they had ever sat across from each other. "After this," she said, and the words were careful because she was choosing them carefully, "when the process is in the hands of the commission and the legal advisors, I'd like to talk, as you said you wanted to." He looked at her. "I'm not sure what it will be," she said. "I don't put things in columns before I understand them." "Neither do I," he said. "Not anymore." Dr. Francis Webb appeared at the chamber door and asked them to return for the closing session. They went back in. The closing session was brief. The commission accepted the report for full formal review. Dr. Webb outlined the process going forward: an independent forensic verification of Clara's analysis, a legal review of the heritage claim process, and an investigative interview with Edmund Castle to establish the chain of suppression. The timeline she gave was 12 to 16 weeks. 12 to 16 weeks. After 100 years, 12 to 16 weeks felt like almost no time at all. After the session ended and the commission members began gathering their papers, Dr. Francis Webb came around the table to speak to Clara directly. "Miss Whitmore," she said. She had a dry, precise handshake. "Your report is one of the most thorough forensic submissions this commission has received in my tenure. The dating discrepancy analysis, in particular, is excellent." "Thank you," Clara said. "I have one observation," Dr. Webb said, off the formal record. Clara waited. "You have been working on the Harrington collection for 3 years," Dr. Webb said. "The deed has been in that collection for considerably longer. Your predecessor archivists had access to the same material you did." "They did," Clara agreed. "None of them found this," Dr. Webb said. She was not asking a question. She was stating something that she wanted Clara to hear stated. "No," Clara said. "I want to understand why you did," Dr. Webb said. Clara thought about it. She thought about the morning she had sat with the deed under the examination light, and felt something wrong about the ink before she could name what it was. She thought about the particular learned patience of someone who had spent years looking at things that most people walked past. "I was looking for it," she said. "Not specifically, But I have always looked for the thing that doesn't fit. I was taught to look for it. I think the people before me were looking for other things that were equally important in their context. I was looking for the wrong ink. Dr. Webb nodded. The right person at the right time, she said. Perhaps, Clara said, or the right training eventually meeting the right moment. Dr. Webb considered that. Then she nodded again and said she would be in touch through the formal commission correspondence channels and moved on to speak with Jeffrey. Clara stood for a moment in the slowly emptying chamber. She had submitted the report. The process was moving. The investigation was in the commission's hands. She had done what she set out to do. Around her, the room was returning to its ordinary quiet. Papers being gathered, chairs pushed back, voices dropping to conversational levels as the formal weight of the session lifted. The Duke appeared at her side again. He did not say anything. He simply stood beside her for a moment, in the way of a person who is present, without requiring anything. She looked at the long table, the empty chairs, the commission's paperwork still spread across the surface. "It's a strange feeling," she said, to no one in particular. "What is?" he asked. "Finishing," she said. "I've been carrying this for months, and now I've put it down, and I'm not sure my hands know what to do yet." He looked at her. "Give them time," he said. "They'll find something." She thought about that. She thought about the next manuscript waiting for her at the archive. She thought about the junior archivist she was training, one of whom had shown real aptitude last week for the kind of careful looking that this work required. She thought about the paper she had been meaning to write on the forensic identification of artificially aged inks, which this investigation had given her new material for that she had not had before. Her hands would find things. They always did. She picked up her bag. She straightened her jacket. "Shall we go?" she said. He held the door. They walked out of the commission building into the afternoon, which was cold and sharp-edged and entirely real, and they walked together into it, without having decided yet what they were to each other, which was fine. The truth had been established. Everything else could be figured out at a reasonable pace. She had learned, over the course of this investigation, that the most important things became clear in their own time. You prepared the conditions, you did the work, and then you paid close attention. She was very good at paying close attention. They walked, and the city moved around them, and somewhere behind them, in a stone building, a commission was beginning the formal process of correcting a 100-year-old wrong. That was enough, for today. That was more than enough. In the weeks that followed the commission's submission, Clara went back to her ordinary work, with the specific relief of someone returning to a room that had always fitted them well. She catalogued, she restored, she ran training sessions. She answered research inquiries from 3 external historians who were consulting the collection for separate projects. She reviewed a batch of newly acquired documents from a private estate sale in the north, checking them against the archive's holdings for duplicates and for anything that warranted further conservation attention. On a Wednesday afternoon, she found a small leather-bound notebook in the new acquisition batch that turned out to contain handwritten accounts from the 1870s, the personal diary of a land surveyor who had worked in the county of Aldenmere for 30 years. She spent an hour reading it with a magnifying glass, and found in it 2 references to the Heronfield estate, described as one of the finest small properties in the county, the land being particularly well drained for agriculture, and the house being of excellent construction. She photographed those pages, and added them to the growing file that the commission's investigators were building on the Heronfield matter. Every piece of evidence helped to establish the estate's genuine value, and the wrongfulness of its loss. The land surveyor's professional opinion, rendered in 1876, described in plain language what George Whitmore had built over decades and what his family had been deprived of. She put the notebook carefully in a preservation sleeve and marked it for further assessment. That same week, Harriet Lowe called again. This time she did not need to find Clara's number through channels. She already had it. She called to say that the news of the commission investigation had reached her father and that he had spoken about it at length over dinner, describing it as the most significant heritage justice case in the commission's recent history. He also said, Harriet added, with the slight careful tone of someone delivering a compliment from a distance, that the archivist who produced the report was clearly exceptional. "He's kind," Clara said. "He's precise," Harriet said. "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. He said exceptional, and he meant it." Clara was quiet for a moment. She found she was more moved by this than she expected. Not because she needed the validation, but because it came from someone who had no reason to offer it, except that it was true. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I thought you should know," Harriet said. "Also, I wondered if you wanted to have lunch sometime. Not for any particular reason, just because I like talking to you at the ball, and I don't often meet people I like talking to." Clara said yes, she meant it. 2 weeks after the submission, the Commission's independent forensic verification of her ink analysis was completed. The report came back, confirming her findings in full. The ink composition analysis, the seal dating, the paper provenance, all confirmed, all consistent with her conclusions. The deed was a forgery. The Commission communicated this to her formally, in a brief letter that used the careful language of institutional confirmation. She filed the letter. She called Oliver Crane to tell him. He was quiet on the phone for a moment. Then he said, "Good. They'll want to interview you in the next few weeks," she said. "The formal investigative interview." "I know," he said. "I'm ready." She asked how he was doing, which she had started doing at the end of their calls in the weeks since the submission, because he had done something significant, at some personal cost, and she was not in the habit of being careless about that. He said he was all right. He was working. He had found a position at a small museum on the south side of the city, assisting with their collections management. He liked it. "Good," she said. She thought, after she put down the phone, that Oliver Crane was a person who had paid a price for doing the right thing and had come out the other side of it in reasonable shape, which was not guaranteed and was worth noting. She thought that she would tell him that when she saw him next. She wanted to tell him that the things he had done mattered, not just to her, to a record that would now exist and be permanent and correct, where before it had been a forged document and a sealed box and 100 years of silence. Permanence was something Clara thought about often. It was the reason she did the work she did. Things that were not properly preserved were lost. Things that were lost became gaps in the record, and gaps in the record were the places where wrong accounts grew, quietly and without challenge, because there was nothing to hold them accountable. She had closed a gap. It would not reopen. In the evenings, she had taken to walking. Not as exercise, though it served as that. As a way of thinking. She walked through the city she had lived in for 6 years, and had never quite felt settled in, always slightly adjacent to it, always slightly running at a different frequency from the social world of polished floors and announced names. She thought about what it meant to belong somewhere, not to a building or a title, to a piece of ground where someone in your family had decided to plant something and build something and refused to surrender it. She thought about Heronfield, which she had never seen except in a black and white photograph taken over a century ago. A medium-sized house with a long garden, good land, well drained. She thought she might go and see it. Not to claim it, not yet. The legal process for formal heritage claims was long and complex, and the Commission had been clear that it would take time. But she might go and stand on the road outside it and look at it, just to see. She made that plan in her head on one of her evening walks, and felt, making it, a small quiet satisfaction that was not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. Something more like recognition. The feeling of finally standing in a place that had been trying to receive you for longer than you knew. She walked home. She made tea. She sat in the lamplight by her window, with a book she had been meaning to read for months. She read. It was a Thursday evening, ordinary and comfortable, and outside her window the city moved in its reliable way, and she turned the pages of her book and she was, for the first time in a long time, simply and completely at rest. She had laid something down. It had needed to be laid down for 4 years, and for 100 before that. And now it was. And there was space, finally, for the things that came next. The Commission's investigative interview with Edmund Castle took place on a Tuesday morning at the end of October, 6 weeks after the initial submission. Clara was not present for it. She did not need to be. Her report spoke for itself, and the Commission's investigators were experienced professionals who did not need her hand on the process. She had done her part. This part was theirs. She heard the broad outcome through the formal notification letter that arrived at the archive the following week. Castle had confirmed, under interview, that Oliver Crane had reported the finding to him. He had confirmed that he had not relayed the information to the Duke. His explanation was what it had been in the vault, an attempt to protect the estate from consequences he had decided unilaterally it would be better off not facing. The Commission's letter described this as a failure of institutional responsibility. It noted that Castle's actions had delayed a legitimate investigation, and that appropriate referrals would be made to the relevant oversight bodies. Clara read the letter at her desk with her morning tea. She filed it in the case folder. She went back to the manuscript she was restoring. The case, as a formal investigation, was in its final stages. The Commission had all the evidence it needed. The legal process for the heritage claim was under separate management now, handled by a firm of heritage solicitors who specialized in exactly this kind of matter, and who had been recommended to Clara by a colleague. She had her first meeting with them the following Friday. She arrived at the solicitor's office at the appointed time. It was a firm that operated from a converted townhouse in a quiet part of the legal district, modest in its exterior and organized in its interior, in the careful way of people who managed complex things and needed to know where everything was. The solicitor she met was named Arthur Brent. He was perhaps 60, with the particular quality of relaxed authority that comes from decades of handling matters that started complicated and needed to become simple. He shook her hand and offered tea, which she accepted, and they sat across a wide desk. "You've read the report," she said. "Thoroughly," he said, "twice. The dating discrepancy is striking." "It's the clearest evidence," she said. "The forgery analysis supports it, but the dates are the thing that cannot be argued with." "Agreed," he said. He opened the folder on his desk. "Now, the heritage claim process. I want to be clear with you from the beginning. This will take time, not because the evidence is weak. It is very strong, but the legal process for restoring property rights in cases of historical fraud involves multiple stages and multiple parties, and none of those stages move quickly." "I know," she said. "I expected that." He looked at her, with the slight assessment of someone who was checking whether a client truly meant that, or was saying it to seem patient. Apparently, he decided she meant it. "I'd say 18 months to 3 years for the full process," he said. "At the conservative end. There may be complications from the current property holders. The Harrington estate has tenants on the land, which creates an additional layer of consideration." "Tenants," she said. She had not thought about the tenants. Of course there were tenants. The estate had been in Harrington hands for over 100 years. People had built their lives on that land. Farmers, perhaps, workers. "The heritage claim process," Arthur Brent said, "does not typically result in the eviction of sitting tenants. The legal framework is about restoring recognition of the original ownership line, which can take various forms. In some cases, financial compensation rather than physical return of the property. In some cases, a formal trust arrangement. In some cases, a combination. "I don't want to displace anyone," she said. He nodded. "We'll make sure that's part of the formal position from the beginning. It gives us more flexibility in the negotiation, and it's the right approach." She sat with that. She had not come to this to take something from other people. She had come to correct a record, to name what had been done, to make the history accurate. The property, the physical acres and the house, were a different question from the record, and the record was, in some ways, the thing she cared about most. The record that said her family had been wronged, the record that said her family had been right, all along, to believe it. The recognition, she said, the formal establishment that the Whitmore family was the legitimate owner and that the 1887 transfer was fraudulent. That part of the process. How long? That part moves faster, Arthur Brent said. 6 to 9 months. Once the Commission's formal finding is issued and the heritage solicitor's process begins, the documentary correction is the first step. The property question comes after. "Then let's start with the documentary correction," she said. He agreed. He outlined the next steps. She listened with her usual precision, asking 3 questions, no more, because all 3 were things she genuinely needed to know, rather than things she was asking to demonstrate that she was paying attention. At the end of the meeting, as she was putting on her coat, Arthur Brent said, "Miss Whitmore, for what it's worth, I've handled a number of heritage matters over the years. Cases where families were trying to recover some recognition of a wrong done a generation or 2 back." "Yes," she said. "The evidence in this case is exceptional," he said. both in quality and in the clarity of the story it tells. Whoever assembled it did very careful work. "Thank you," she said. She walked out into the afternoon. The following Saturday, she drove north. It took 2 hours. She had put Harenfield into a mapping application that morning over breakfast, and it had given her a route through the city, and then out through the suburbs, and then through countryside, that opened up on both sides of the road, the further north she went. Green fields, stone walls, a gray sky that sat low and close to the hills, the kind of sky that meant rain later but was dry for now. She found the road that the mapping application directed her down, a narrow lane between 2 stretches of hedgerow. She slowed. She came around a bend in the lane. And there it was. She stopped the car. She had not known what she would feel when she saw it. She had tried not to anticipate the feeling, because anticipation of feelings was not something she had ever found useful. Feelings arrived when they arrived. You could not prepare for them any more than you could prepare for weather. The house was stone-fronted, medium-sized, as the surveyor's diary had described. The garden on the south side was visible over the low stone wall that edged the lane. It was a working farm now, or connected to one. She could see outbuildings beyond the main house, and the shapes of equipment in a yard to the east. The fields around it were well kept. The land looked like what the surveyor had said it was. Good land. She sat in her car on the narrow lane, and she looked at the house for a long time. She thought about her great-great-grandfather, who had stood somewhere on this land and written a letter saying, "This is my family's home. I will not sell it. I will not surrender it." He had not surrendered it willingly. It had been taken from him. But the house was still standing. The land was still well drained, apparently, because the fields looked healthy. The stone wall along the lane was old stone, old mortar, the kind of construction that lasted when it was done right. She thought, he built this well. She thought, it's still here. She sat for perhaps 20 minutes. Then she started the car and turned around in a passing place and drove back down the lane. She drove home through the gray afternoon, with the rain starting as she joined the main road, the way it does in the country, without warning, decisive. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel sad. She felt something that she decided, on the drive home, to describe as anchored, as though a thread she had not known was loose had found the thing it was supposed to be connected to, and settled into place. She was the granddaughter of Edmund Whitmore. She was the great-great-great-granddaughter of George Whitmore, who had built a house with good stone and refused to surrender it. She had found the proof of that wrong. She had put it in front of people who had the authority to correct the record. She was going to see it corrected. She drove home in the rain, and she thought about her father's note. Someone should know. She thought, you were right, Dad. Someone should know. And someone did. The world would know it too, when the commission issued its finding. She drove into the city as the evening came on around her, the streetlights coming up, the city gathering itself into its evening routines. She parked. She walked up the stairs above the bookshop. She made tea, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the familiar dark street. Her phone rang. She looked at it. The Duke. She answered. "Where are you?" he said, not in a demanding way, in the way of someone who had been thinking about her during the day, and was asking the most direct version of that thought. "Home," she said. "I drove north today, to see the estate." A pause. How was it? She thought about the right word. Real, she said. "I think I needed it to be real." "Yes," he said. She looked out at the street. "How was your day?" she asked. It was a simple question, and she asked it simply. Not because she was performing interest, because she was interested in how he was managing the thing he had chosen to do, which was not an easy thing, in who he was becoming on the other side of it. He told her. He spoke for a few minutes about the estate, about conversations with his legal team, about a letter he had written and rewritten 3 times to the tenants at Harenfield, explaining the situation honestly and assuring them that the process would be handled with their security in mind. "You wrote to them yourself?" she said. "They deserve to hear from the person responsible," he said. She thought about that, about the choice to be the person who faced a thing directly, rather than the person who managed it from a distance. About how much harder the direct version was, and how much more it was worth. "How did they respond?" she asked. The main farming family has been there for 30 years, he said. They're concerned, naturally, but they appreciated the direct communication, or so they said. People appreciate honesty, she said, even when the news is complicated. I'm learning that, he said. She finished her tea. Outside, the rain had started again. It made a quiet sound against the window glass, the small, reliable percussion of water on a surface. I'd like to take you to dinner, he said, not as part of any process, just dinner, when you're ready for that. She thought about whether she was ready for that. She thought about the columns she kept in her notes. Observation versus evidence. Known versus suspected. Proven versus pending. She thought, some things you cannot put in columns. Some things you have to simply decide. Saturday? She said. Saturday, he agreed. She put down the phone. She stood at the window in the kitchen of her small apartment above the bookshop, and she listened to the rain. She thought about a house with stone walls, and a long garden and fields that were well drained and apparently well managed, and still standing after 130 years. She thought about what her great-great-grandfather had built when he decided that something was worth keeping. She thought, good things last when they're built right. She went to bed at a reasonable hour. She slept well. The dinner on Saturday was at a restaurant in the older part of the city, quiet and well lit, the kind of place that had been there for decades and did not need to announce itself. He had chosen it, and she had approved it without seeing it, and arrived to find she would have chosen something similar herself, which she noted, with the interest of someone who pays attention to alignment. They sat across from each other at a small table by a window that looked out onto a courtyard. The restaurant was full, but the tables were well spaced, and the noise was at a level that allowed conversation without requiring effort. She had not been on a dinner that was simply a dinner in some time. She had been on working meetings, professional lunches, a conference dinner once that had felt like a professional lunch with worse acoustics. She had not been in a room with someone and had the room be entirely about nothing except the two of them talking. It was pleasant. That was not a small word. Pleasant, when something had genuinely earned it, was exactly the right word. He asked her about her work, not about the investigation, which they had tacitly agreed was not the territory of this evening, about the rest of her work, about the manuscripts she restored, about what it felt like to hold something from the 1600s in your hands and be the person responsible for keeping it stable for the next several hundred years. She told him. She found herself talking at a length and a depth she did not usually reach with people she did not know very well, which she noticed while it was happening, and decided was worth not interrupting. He listened the way he had listened in the vault and in his office and on the phone, with the full weight of his attention. She found herself thinking, this is a man who became a better listener in the past 6 weeks, who had always had the capacity for it, but had been, for whatever reason of upbringing or habit, not exercising it, and who was now exercising it deliberately. She asked him about architecture. He knew a surprising amount about the history of the buildings in the city, the ones she had always noticed but not known the stories of. He told her about the commission that built the Heritage Review Commission building, and the debates that preceded its construction, and the compromise between the style the commission wanted and the materials budget available, which had resulted in a building that looked intended, even though its execution had been partly improvised. She said she had not known that. He said most people didn't. But if you looked at the north face of the building in good morning light, you could see where the stone changed color slightly, about a third of the way up, where they had switched to a slightly different quarry source when the first one ran short. She said she was going to look for that. He said he would be interested to know if she found it. They talked for 3 hours. At the end of the evening, walking back through the old streets toward the car he had arranged, he said, "Thank you for this." She looked at him. "For dinner?" "For not making it complicated," he said, "when it could have been." She thought about that, about all the ways it could have been complicated, all the categories and histories and weights it carried, and about the fact that she had simply walked in and sat down and been herself, and it had gone from there. "Some things are simpler than they look," she said, "if you give them room." He looked at her with the particular quiet she had come to think of as his version of warmth, the version of it that his face expressed when it was not performing anything. "Yes," he said. She went home. She unlocked her door. She hung up her coat. She sat down in the armchair by the reading lamp, and she let the evening settle around her for a few minutes before she picked up her book. She thought, something is beginning. She thought, I'm all right with that. She turned to her page and read. And outside the city made its nighttime sounds, and the lamplight was warm and even, and she was comfortable in the exact place where she was. It was, by most measures, an ordinary evening. And ordinary evenings, after everything, are their own kind of gift. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. Clara had expected the investigation process to feel dramatic from the inside, the way things sometimes look from the outside, when you are not the person living through them. The reality was quieter than that. It was meetings, and correspondence, and waiting. It was Arthur Brent sending updates that were formal and measured. It was commission letters arriving in plain envelopes. It was the legal machinery moving at the pace legal machinery moved, which was not designed for urgency, but for correctness. She did not mind. She had work. She had 3 manuscripts in active restoration. She was writing the ink analysis paper she had been planning, using the investigation's findings as a case study, with all the identifying details properly handled. She had agreed to present a methodology paper at a heritage conference in the spring, which required preparation that she found absorbing in the best way. She had the junior archivist, whose name was Philip, and who had the kind of natural attention to detail that you could not teach but could develop, and who was now 3 months into his training, and beginning to understand what it meant to look at something until it told you what it actually was, rather than what it appeared to be. She had Saturday dinners that were becoming a reliable and entirely comfortable part of her week. She had Harriet, who turned out to be exactly as interesting as she had seemed at the ball, and whose lunch company she had now enjoyed 4 times in as many months. She had, in short, a life that was full, in the way she had always wanted it to be full, but had not always managed to make it, partly from the weight of carrying things that needed to be put down, and partly from the particular loneliness of being very good at something that not many people understood well enough to share. She was putting things down. She was finding people who understood. It was slow. It was real. She preferred it that way. And at the center of it, steady and accumulating, the knowledge that what she had done would stand, that the record would be corrected, that somewhere in the official archive of the kingdom's heritage documentation, the truth of the Whitmore family and the Heronfield estate would be set down clearly and permanently, available to anyone who needed to know it, now and for whatever came after. She thought about that on the evenings when she sat with her books, her tea, her familiar small apartment. She thought about the permanence of the record, about the work that went into making something permanent, about the fact that her father had known the truth and carried it without being able to set it in a form that would outlast him. She had said it now. It would outlast all of them. That was the thing about documents, properly cared for and correctly made. They lasted. They carried forward what was entrusted to them. They held the record against time and against the people who wanted the record to say something it didn't. She had spent her career taking care of documents. Now she had made one that would take care of her family's name. She thought that was the right way around. She thought her father would have agreed with her. She closed her book one evening and looked at the dark window and said, very quietly, in the way you say things that you know no one will hear, and you say them anyway, because they need to be said. Someone knows, Dad. She sat with the quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her book and went back to reading. The lamplight was warm. The street below was quiet. And the record was set. The commission issued its formal finding on a gray Thursday morning in February, 7 months after Clara had walked into the Heritage Review Commission building with a 47-page report in an archive envelope. She had been at her desk for an hour already when the letter arrived by formal courier. It was a thick envelope, cream-colored, the commission's seal on the front. She signed for it. She set it on her desk. She did not open it immediately. She finished the sentence she had been writing in her catalog notes. She saved the file. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk, and then she picked up the envelope. She opened it carefully, because she opened all documents carefully. It was not a performance. It was simply what she did. The finding was 14 pages. She read all of it. The first page contained the summary, which was the thing everyone would quote, and the thing that would eventually appear in the newspaper coverage and the heritage records. She read it twice. The Heritage Review Commission, having conducted a full investigation of the documentary evidence submitted by Miss Clara Whitmore, Senior Forensic Archivist, Royal Heritage Archive, and having completed an independent forensic verification, a documentary chain of custody review, and investigative interviews with all relevant parties, finds as follows. The land transfer deed dated December 1887, purporting to record the transfer of the Heronfield estate from the Whitmore family to the Aldenmere estate, is not an authentic instrument. The deed was produced fraudulently, after the fact, to provide false documentary basis for a transfer that occurred by other means. The original family, known subsequently as the Whitmore family, is confirmed as the rightful holder of the Heronfield property under the legitimate ownership line. A formal heritage recognition proceeding is initiated herewith. She read it again. Then she set it down on her desk and sat very still for a moment. She was not going to let herself fall apart in her office. She was a professional. She was at work. This was the confirmed outcome of a process that had proceeded correctly and produced the correct result. She breathed in. She breathed out. She picked up the phone and called Arthur Brent. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been watching for her call. "I have the finding," she said. "So do I," he said. His voice had the warmth of a man who had just read something he had worked toward, in full. "Clara, it is an exceptional finding. The language is clear and unambiguous. The commission has been thorough. What happens now?" she said. "Now the formal heritage recognition proceeding begins," he said. "I'll handle the documentation. The first stage is the registration of the recognition in the official record, which should happen within 30 days. After that, we begin the property resolution discussions, which, as I said, will take longer. But the record correction happens first, and it is binding." "The record correction," she said. "Within 30 days, he said, the official heritage record will reflect that the Whitmore family is the legitimate ownership line for the Heronfield estate, and that the 1887 transfer was fraudulent. That will be a permanent part of the national heritage documentation." She looked at the letter in her hand. "Thank you, Arthur," she said. She put down the phone. She sat for another moment in the quiet of her office. Around her, the archive went about its morning. She could hear Jeffrey on the phone in the room across the hall. She could hear Philip somewhere in the back, moving something carefully. The familiar sounds of careful people taking care of things that mattered. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen. Not a pencil this time, and she wrote a brief note to Oliver Crane. She told him the finding had been issued. She told him it was in full, and it was clear. She told him what he had done, the letter in the box, the invitation, the risk he had taken on behalf of people he did not know, had made this possible. She wrote, "You should know that." She sealed the note in an envelope and put it in the outgoing mail. Then she called Jeffrey. He appeared in her doorway a moment later. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good," in exactly the way he said things when he meant them fully. She nodded. "I'll make tea," he said. She nodded again. He disappeared. She heard the kettle. She picked up her phone and found the number she was looking for and wrote a message. "The finding came this morning. Are in full. Thought you should know first." She put the phone down. It buzzed within 2 minutes. The reply was brief. "I know. I just received my copy. Are you all right?" She looked at the question and thought about what the true answer was. She wrote back, "Yes, I think I actually am." The finding was published in the official commission record 3 days after it was issued. The heritage documentation system was publicly accessible, and Clara knew from experience that researchers and journalists who monitored the commission's official records for newsworthy findings would find it quickly. She had anticipated news coverage. She had not anticipated how much. The story broke in the national paper on a Saturday morning. A headline about the commission's finding, the forged deed, the wrongful transfer, the century-old land fraud. It used her name. It used the Duke's name. It described the investigation in the kind of language that newspapers used for stories that involved both historical injustice and a well-known aristocratic family. By Saturday afternoon, 2 more papers had picked it up. By Sunday morning, it was in the international press. The headline she read most often was something along the lines of, "Archivist exposes century-old noble family fraud, restores family's heritage." Some versions were more sensational. Some were more measured. The most precise one, from a heritage journalism outlet that covered these matters with real expertise, described her work with the kind of technical accuracy that she could tell had been written by someone who had actually read the report. She read that one twice. She did not read many of the others. She received 3 interview requests on the Saturday and 4 more on the Sunday. She declined all of them. Not because she was hiding from the story. The story was accurate and correct, and she was entirely prepared for it to be public. But she had said what she had to say in 47 pages of forensic documentation, and she did not need to add to it for the cameras. She called Harriet, who had sent her a message that morning, saying simply, "Saw the papers." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Clara told her, a little overwhelmed by the noise. "Come for lunch," Harriet said. "Here, I'll cook. No cameras." She went. Harriet's flat was on the west side of the city, small and warm, with books on every available surface, in a style of organization that was either extremely personal or extremely chaotic, and possibly both. She cooked pasta and opened wine and did not ask Clara to explain or process or reflect on anything. She talked about other things, a film she had seen, a book she had read, a conversation she had had with her father about the commission's announcement, which had prompted a dinner table discussion that had apparently gotten quite spirited about the nature of inherited responsibility. Clara sat at Harriet's small kitchen table and ate pasta and drank wine and was grateful, in a complete and uncomplicated way, for a person who knew when to talk about other things. She went home in the early evening. There were more messages on her phone. She read the ones from people she knew and responded to them briefly. She did not read the others. She made tea. She sat in her armchair. She thought about the 14-page findings sitting on her desk at the archive, about the language in the first page, fraudulent, rightful holder, legitimate ownership line. A formal heritage recognition proceeding is initiated herewith. She thought about her father saying, "It was taken, but I could never prove it." She said, very quietly, to the empty room, "It's proven, Dad." She sat for a while longer in the lamplight. Then she picked up her book. Monday morning, she went back to work. She arrived at her usual time. She said good morning to Jeffrey, who said good morning back, without making the weekend news the subject of conversation, which she appreciated. She said good morning to Philip, who was already at his workstation, with his cotton gloves on, and one of the new acquisition manuscripts open on the examination mat. She sat down. She took out the catalog notes she had been working on Thursday morning, before the finding arrived. She found the sentence she had been writing. She finished it. She moved on to the next entry. The investigation was complete. The record was being corrected. The legal process for the property resolution was in Arthur Brent's capable hands. Her part, the technical part, the forensic part, the part that only she could have done, and that she had done as carefully and completely as she knew how, was finished. She had the next manuscript. She had the ink analysis paper. She had Philip's training schedule. She had the conference preparation for spring. She had work. She had always had work. She put on her reading glasses and picked up her pencil. She had a 100-year-old document to understand, and she intended to understand it completely. The rest would take care of itself. Outside her window, the morning was moving in its ordinary way, people and traffic, and the particular ordinary energy of a city getting on with itself. Inside the archive, the old things waited in their careful dark, patient and enduring, full of the stories that careful people extracted from them one line at a time. She bent her head over her work. She began. The interview request she eventually accepted came not from a newspaper but from a heritage publication. The Heritage Record was a journal she had read since her student years, a quarterly publication that covered archival work, heritage law, and documentary preservation, with the kind of seriousness that the field deserved. Its editor had written to her through the archive's official address, a formal letter, not a message or an email, but an actual letter, which she had appreciated as a form of signal that the request was coming from people who understood that she worked with documents, and that documents meant something. She wrote back and accepted. The interview was conducted by a writer named Francis Doyle, who had been covering heritage law and archival practice for 12 years, and who arrived at the archive in person for the meeting, rather than requesting it be done remotely. Frances Doyle was a woman of perhaps 50, who took her own notes in a small notebook with a fountain pen, which Clara also noticed and appreciated. They sat in the archive's small meeting room, which held a table and 4 chairs, and a window that looked onto the internal courtyard. Frances Doyle asked good questions, specific questions, the kind that showed she had read the commission finding and the forensic analysis and understood what she was reading. Clara answered them with the same precision she brought to everything. She explained the ink analysis. She explained what wrong oxidation looked like under examination and why it was detectable to a trained eye, but not to a general one. She explained the significance of the dating discrepancy, which Frances Doyle already understood, but wanted Clara to describe in her own words for the publication's readers, some of whom might be reading about forensic document analysis for the first time. She explained what the sealed box had contained and what the presence of those documents meant for the historical record. She did not dramatize any of it. She described it as what it was: methodical work, carried out with specific tools, producing verifiable conclusions. Work that anyone with the right training and enough patience could replicate, because that was the nature of evidence. Frances Doyle asked, near the end, "You have described the investigation in very technical terms, which is appropriate, and I've found it fascinating. But I want to ask you something slightly different. This was your own family's history. You were the granddaughter of the wronged family, and also the person with the expertise to investigate the wrong. What was that like?" Clara sat with the question for a moment. "Strange," she said. "At first I kept the two things separate in my mind. The professional investigation and the personal history. I was careful to do that because I didn't want the personal history to make me see things that weren't there. And later," Frances Doyle said. "Later I understood that they weren't really separable," Clara said. "The reason I chose this work, the reason I was trained to see what I saw in that document, was connected to having grown up, knowing there was something wrong in my family's past. The professional capacity and the personal investment had the same source." Frances Doyle wrote something in her notebook. "One more question," she said. "The Duke of Aldenmere cooperated with the investigation voluntarily and publicly. That is unusual in cases where a noble family is implicated in historical wrongdoing." "It is," Clara agreed. "What do you make of it?" Clara thought about him signing the authorization form before reading the formal language. About him in the vault, watching her open a box that was about to change what he understood about his family. About the letter to the tenants, written in his own hand, because the people who lived on that land deserved to hear from the person responsible. "I make of it," she said carefully, "that some people, when confronted with a wrong, choose to face it, even when facing it costs them something. That is not common, but it is possible, and it matters that it is possible." Frances Doyle nodded. She closed her notebook. The article was published 6 weeks later. Clara read it on a Sunday morning at her kitchen table with her first cup of tea. It was 12 pages in the print edition. The headline was, "The Woman Who Corrected a Century." She read it once, beginning to end. It was accurate. She folded the journal and put it on the shelf with the others. She made a second cup of tea. She sat at her kitchen table for a while, in the comfortable Sunday morning quiet, and she thought about what it meant to have a 100-year-old wrong in the record, and what it meant to have it corrected, and what it meant to be the person who had done the correcting. She thought that what it meant, most honestly, was this: that her father had been right, that her great-great-grandfather had been right, that the wrong had been real, and the record had been false, and someone had needed to pay close enough attention to find the gap between the two. She had paid attention. That was all. That was everything. She picked up her pen and turned to a fresh page in her notebook and wrote the first line of the methodology section for her ink analysis paper, which she had been working on for 3 weeks and which was due to the journal at the end of the month. She worked. Outside, the Sunday moved quietly around her. She worked. She was still at her kitchen table 3 hours later when her phone rang. She answered it without looking at the name, which was unusual for her, but she was in the middle of a thought. "You read the article," he said. "This morning," she said. "Good," he said. There was a pause. "I read it too. She got it right." "She did," Clara agreed. She put down her pen. "The quote she used from you," he said, "about people choosing to face a wrong, even when it cost them something." She waited. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever it cost, it was the right cost." She thought about that. She thought about all the versions of this that might have gone differently. If he had chosen to manage the situation rather than open the box. If he had let institutional protection close around the finding, the way it sometimes did. If he had been, in the end, simply a man shaped entirely by what had been given to him, and unable to choose differently. He had been able to choose differently. She thought that mattered more than she had yet found words for. "I know," she said. "Saturday?" he said. "Yes," she said. She put the phone down and picked up her pen and found the line of thought she had put down and went back to it. She was nearly at the end of the methodology section. She had a long afternoon of work ahead of her, the good kind of work, the kind that needed the full use of her mind and her training and everything she had built over years of paying close and careful attention to old things and the truths they carried. She bent her head. She wrote. Philip stopped in her doorway late that Monday, 2 days after the journal article had gone out. She looked up. He was holding a document in his cotton gloves, carefully, the way she had taught him. "This came in the new acquisition batch this morning," he said. "I wasn't sure if you'd already seen it." She had not. He brought it to her workstation. He set it on the examination mat without being asked to, which she noted. He was learning. She looked at it. It was a letter. Old, genuinely old, the ink color and paper texture right for the period. She checked the date at the top, 1879, written in the particular hand of the mid-Victorian period, compact and slanting slightly to the right. She read the opening line. It was addressed to a land registry official, and it was from a man named George Whitmore, requesting confirmation of the official registration of the Heronfield property, in the name of the Whitmore family. Her great-great-grandfather, 8 years before the estate was taken, formally registering his ownership through the official channels. The registration confirmation that this letter would have prompted, the official record of the Whitmore family's legitimate ownership, had either never been found, or had been lost, or removed, from the archive at some point. The absence of that confirmation had been one of the complicating factors in the heritage claim's early stages, because it required the commission to establish the ownership line through inference and secondary documentation, rather than direct registration records. This letter was the direct registration request. The confirmation it produced might still exist somewhere, in a registry archive, in another private collection, but the request itself, in George Whitmore's own hand, 8 years before anyone tried to take the estate from him, was here. Clara looked at Philip. "Where did this come in from?" she said. "The Morton estate sale," he said. "The batch from last month. It was in a miscellaneous correspondence bundle. I nearly missed it." She looked at him. "You didn't miss it," she said. He looked at the document, and then at her. He did not say anything, but she could see him understanding the weight of what he was holding. "Good work," she said. He nodded and stepped back. She sat for a moment, with the letter on the mat in front of her. Then she picked up the phone. Arthur Brent picked up. She told him what she had found. She heard the particular quiet on his end that meant he was processing something significant. "Get it to me as soon as you can," he said. "This goes into the property resolution file immediately. I'll photograph it today and send the digital copies tonight," she said. "The original will come through formal transfer." "Excellent," he said. She put down the phone. She looked at the letter. George Whitmore, 1879, writing to an official to confirm that the house he had built, on the land that was his, was properly registered in the name of his family. He had done everything right. He had registered the property. He had refused to sell it. He had written letters and retained a solicitor, and maintained his position through 2 years of pressure from a family with more power than his. He had done everything a careful and honest man could do, and it had not been enough. But the letter was here now, in her archive, in her hands, or in Philip's hands, which was the same thing, because Philip was learning what she knew, and one day he would know it fully, and he would pass it forward to the next careful person who came after him. The letter had survived. The record had survived. It had waited 140 years for someone to find it. She was glad it had not had to wait any longer. She put on her cotton gloves. She began to photograph the letter, methodically and completely, one careful frame at a time. The reopening of the Palace Gallery happened on a Friday afternoon in April, 11 months after the night Clara had first stood in front of a painting of Harenfield in a borrowed ivory gown and felt the particular weight of being made invisible in a room full of people. She had been asked to curate the reopening. The request had come from the Heritage Conservation Board, through Harriet's father, who now knew Clara's work well enough to make a direct approach rather than going through institutional channels. The gallery was undergoing a scheduled renovation, its display cases being updated, and its document mounts being replaced with properly archival materials throughout, which meant that every document in the Harrington donation section would be remounted, correctly this time, with nothing obscured. Clara had accepted. She had spent 6 weeks on it, working with the palace's conservation team to ensure every document was properly assessed, properly housed, and properly labeled with accurate information. Some items needed light restoration. She did that herself, because some things she preferred to handle with her own hands. The gallery display that had held the third frame letter was redesigned completely. The letter from George Whitmore, the 1884 correspondence, that had been improperly mounted to hide his name, was now the centerpiece of a dedicated display. It was properly mounted with the full document visible, his name clear in the lower left corner, the date clear at the top. A placard beside it gave the context: an original letter from the Whitmore family, whose Harenfield estate had been taken fraudulently in 1887 in a transaction that the Heritage Review Commission had formally ruled to be without legitimate basis. The Harrington crest was still on the wall. This was also correct. History was not made clean by removing the inconvenient parts. It was made honest by adding the full truth beside them. On the placard, below the description of the letter, there was a second line. This letter was identified through the forensic investigation conducted by Clara Whitmore, a descendant of the Whitmore family, whose work led to the Commission's formal finding of historical fraud in February of this year. She had not written that line. The board had added it. She had read it 3 times when she saw the proof of the display card, standing at her workbench in the archive. She had not changed it. She had put on her reading glasses and gone back to work on the next manuscript. The reopening was attended by a modest crowd: Heritage Board members, Palace administrative staff, several conservation colleagues. Arthur Brent, who had driven over from his office specifically and stood near the back with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had seen a complex thing reach its proper conclusion. Geoffrey, who had taken the afternoon off from the archive and arrived with his reading glasses on a cord and the slightly formal manner he adopted on occasions that required it. Philip, who had been invited because he had found the 1879 letter and it was right that he be there. Harriet, who had worn something the color of warm yellow and whose presence had the effect it always had of making the room feel both more comfortable and more alive. And the Duke, who stood near the doorway of the gallery with the bearing that was simply how he stood, which Clara had come to understand was not performance but structure, the upright posture of a man who had been taught that you stood straight and was still doing it now, though the reasons behind it had changed. Clara moved through the gallery before the formal part of the event, checking that everything was where she had positioned it, that the lighting was as she had specified, that the information cards were all in the correct positions. She was an archivist. She checked things. That did not change because an occasion was significant. The third frame, she stopped in front of it. George Whitmore, 1884. His handwriting, which she now knew as well as her own father's handwriting, from years of looking at the letters in the box under the bed, the slant of it, the particular loop of the W that began his surname, the careful, formal style of someone who had learned to write at a time when writing was an act that required effort and was therefore performed with attention. She looked at his name. She had a complicated feeling about George Whitmore that she had been trying to find words for since the day she had first seen those 7 partial letters in the corner of the improperly mounted display, and known, before she could fully justify the knowledge, what she was looking at. She felt something that was somewhere between grief and pride and gratitude, which were an unlikely combination, but apparently occupied the same space in her chest when they came together. She felt connected. That was the simplest word. She felt the particular and quiet connection of standing in a place that was part of a story, that was also partly hers, holding a thread that ran back through time to a man she had never met and would never meet, whose choices and whose loss and whose refusal to surrender were all still present in the documents she had spent her professional life learning to read. She stood in front of the frame for a moment. Then she stepped back. She turned to the room. The guests had gathered at the gallery entrance, where the board chairman was preparing to say a few words. She found Jeffrey and stood beside him, which was comfortable in the way of long professional acquaintance. He looked at the display briefly, and then at her, with the expression he had when he approved of something, but did not intend to make a speech about it. The chairman spoke. He spoke briefly and well about the gallery's history and the renovation, and the value of preserving documents that told difficult truths as well as easy ones. He mentioned the commission finding. He mentioned Clara's name. She did not bow her head. She stood and received the acknowledgement with the straightforwardness of someone who had done what she had done and was prepared to be recognized for it, without false modesty and without performance. It had required her full capacity. She was not going to pretend otherwise. It was all right for people to know that. After the chairman's remarks, the guests moved into the gallery. The conversations began, the kind of quiet, pleasant conversations that people have in rooms full of interesting things, when they are also in the company of other people who find interesting things interesting. Clara spoke with several people she knew, and several she was meeting for the first time. She answered questions about the restoration process and the display design. She pointed out the specific mounting technique she had used for the more fragile items, and explained why it was preferable to the previous approach. She was, by every measure, at ease. She had not thought she would be. She had thought she might feel the ghost of the previous visit more strongly. The borrowed gown, the champagne glass held to give her hands something to do, the flash of heat when he said what he said, and she had lowered her head in this very building. She did not feel that ghost. She felt the room as it was now, her gallery, her work on the walls, her family's name, correctly inscribed, in the third frame. Harriet found her near the center of the gallery and said something warm and entirely like herself. Arthur Brent came and shook her hand and said he had good news about the property resolution timeline that he would share in detail when they met next week, but that she should know it was moving faster than projected. Philip was standing in front of the display she had centered on, the 1879 registration letter, the one he had found in the acquisition batch, reading the information card with the absorbed focus of someone who was still learning what it meant when a document survived to be read. She watched him for a moment. Then the Duke was beside her. He had waited. She had been aware of him moving through the room, and had been aware of the deliberate space he was giving her to be present in the space first, on her own terms, before he joined her. She had noticed that. It was, she had come to understand, simply how he paid attention. He said nothing for a moment. She said nothing. They stood in her gallery, in a comfortable silence, that had, by now, a texture to it, that was its own kind of language. "You should see what they've done with the East Corridor," he said finally. "The conservation team found a mural under the paint, 3 layers down. It's from the original building." She turned to look at him. "Original building? 14th century," he said. "They've only uncovered a section of it so far, but it appears to be exceptional." She thought about a mural, 3 layers under the paint, waiting for someone to come along with the patience and the proper tools and remove what had been laid over it. "I want to see it," she said. They walked through the gallery together, away from the main event and into the East Corridor, where the conservation team had set up a temporary protective screen around the section of wall they were working on. Someone had left the work light on. They stood in front of the uncovered section. It was roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, the only portion visible so far. The paint was from the original plaster, in shades of red and dark blue, that had held their color remarkably well under 3 layers of later decoration. The image was partial, but she could see the curve of an arch and the edge of a figure and the beginning of a pattern along the bottom border that would have continued, once, for the full length of the corridor. She looked at it. She thought about everything that had been covered and recovered, about the record that had been covered by the forged deed and recovered by her analysis, about the gallery letter that had been covered by the improperly mounted mat board, about the mural that had been covered by 3 successive layers of paint, each applied by people who did not know or did not think about what was underneath. About the 1879 letter, which had not been covered but lost, tucked into a miscellaneous bundle in a private estate, surviving without knowing it had been preserved. Things that survived, things that could be recovered, things that needed someone to remove what had been laid over them. She had done that. It's exceptional, she said, about the mural. They think they can uncover the full corridor by the end of the summer, he said. I'd like to be there when they do, she said. He looked at her. The work light threw warm gold across the visible fragment of the mural, and across both of them. He had the expression he had when he was about to say something real, rather than something social. You know, he said, you are going to be the most inconvenient person I have ever known. She looked at him. In what sense? In the sense, he said, that you are going to keep finding things that everyone else walked past. And you are going to require the rest of us to look at them. And it is not always going to be comfortable. She thought about that. Is that a complaint? No, he said. It is the most truthful compliment I know how to give you. She looked at the uncovered mural, at the fragment of arch, the edge of a figure, the beginning of a pattern that would, when the full corridor was revealed, be more complete and more extraordinary than any of the layers laid over it. I'm not going to apologize for it, she said. I know, he said. That's the point. They stood together in the east corridor, in the quiet that was the good kind, the kind where there is nothing that needs to be said, because everything necessary is already understood. She thought about the last 11 months, about the seal on an envelope she had almost set aside, about an ink that had not aged correctly, about a date on a legal notice that could not be reconciled with the deed it preceded, about a name at the corner of a poorly mounted display document, 7 letters that a careful person noticed while everyone else admired the room. She thought about her father. She thought about George Whitmore in 1884, writing a letter that would outlive everyone who had ever tried to make it not matter. She thought, nothing that was real can be made permanently invisible by putting something false in front of it. She thought, you only need the right tools, and enough patience to use them. She had those. She had always had those. She turned away from the mural. They walked back into the gallery together. Around them, the people moved and talked, and looked at the things on the walls, and the things on the walls looked back with the particular and patient endurance of old documents that had survived because someone had understood their value. Clara stood in the room that held her great-great-grandfather's letter, and the correctly recorded truth of what had been done to him and undone, and she stood with her shoulders level, and her head up, and no borrowed gown, and no apologetic weight, and no bowing of the head in any direction. She had heard herself described as nobody important once, in this building. She thought about that now, and it felt, from this distance, like something that had happened to someone she used to be, someone who had not yet put down what she was carrying, someone who had not yet built the case, opened the box, sat across from the truth, and named it out loud without her voice shaking once. She had done all of that. And the record was there, in the archive, and in the commission's official findings, and in the display case, 5 feet away, with the lighting properly angled, and the mount correctly positioned, and the name Whitmore clear and full and permanent, in the lower left corner of the glass. Nobody important. She had heard worse things said about people who had done what mattered. She turned to Jeffrey, who was standing nearby with a cup of tea, and the quietly pleased expression of someone who had watched someone he knew do something that deserved to be done. Ready? She said. Always, he said. They walked together into the rest of the evening, through the gallery she had restored, and into the long corridor, where a mural was coming back into the light layer by layer, and beyond that, into the ordinary and remarkable continuing life that Clara Whitmore had built for herself out of the materials available to her, which had always been, it turned out, more than enough. She had always known how to find what others missed. Now everyone else did too. The end. 3 weeks after the gallery reopening, the formal Heritage Recognition Certificate arrived. It came in a heavy cream envelope, larger than a standard letter, with the Heritage Review Commission's gold-embossed seal in the upper left corner. It was addressed to Miss Clara Whitmore, C.O., the Royal Heritage Archive. She received it on a Wednesday morning, which was an ordinary Wednesday. She had been in the middle of writing. Jeffrey had brought it to her door without ceremony, set it on the edge of her desk, and returned to his work. He understood about letting people open important things in their own time. She kept writing for 10 more minutes. She finished the paragraph she was on. Then she picked up the envelope. Inside was a single printed certificate, formal and ornate in the way of official documents, bordered in a thin gold line, printed on heavy paper. It confirmed, In the language of institutions, the full formal recognition of the Whitmore family as the legitimate ownership line of the Heronfield estate, and the official void of the 1887 land transfer deed. It listed the investigation reference number and the date of the commission finding. It listed her name as the lead investigative archivist. At the bottom, in the space reserved for supplementary remarks, someone had written by hand, "This certificate represents one of the most rigorously evidenced heritage restoration cases in the Commission's history. The investigative work that produced this outcome was conducted with exceptional skill and professional integrity." It was signed by Dr. Francis Webb. Clara read it. She set it down on her desk. She looked at it. She was sitting in an archive that smelled of old paper and the particular cool of controlled air and centuries of careful work by people who had understood that some things were worth preserving, at whatever cost the preservation required. She thought about the night she had stood outside the palace gates in a borrowed gown, deciding whether she was brave enough to go in. She thought, yes. It turned out I was. She put the certificate back in the envelope. She filed the envelope in the case folder, which was thick now with documentation and correspondence, and printouts of the commission findings, and Arthur Brent's letters, and Oliver Crane's statement, and all the pieces that had come together to make the full and true account of what had happened, and what had been corrected. She picked up her pen. She went back to the paper she was writing. She had a deadline at the end of the month, and 3 sections still to complete, and 2 pages of notes still to incorporate. And the work was good work, and it needed doing, and she was the right person to do it. She wrote. She was still writing when Philip knocked at 4 to say he was leaving for the day, and to ask if she needed anything before he went. She told him she was fine. She told him to go. He went. She wrote for another hour. Then she put down her pen and stretched her fingers, and looked out the window at the archive's internal courtyard, where the last of the afternoon light was moving across the stone at a low angle, throwing shadows along the old walls. She thought about a mural coming back to the light, layer by layer, through the patient work of people who understood that what was underneath was worth the effort of uncovering. She thought, yes, that is what we do. She turned off her desk lamp. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. She walked through the archive, past the careful dark of the storage rooms, past Jeffrey's empty desk, through the entrance hall with its familiar smell and its familiar quiet. She went out into the evening. The city was doing what cities do at that hour, full of movement and noise and the comfortable energy of 1,000 lives in the middle of their ordinary business. She walked into it without hesitation. She had a dinner to get to. She had a paper to finish. She had a conference presentation to prepare, and a junior archivist to train, and a mural being uncovered by the length of a corridor, and a property resolution process that Arthur Brent had told her last week was ahead of schedule. She had work she loved, and people she had chosen, and a name that was correctly recorded in the official heritage documentation of the kingdom. She had a life that had been built carefully, over years, with the tools she had, and the patience she had practiced, and the particular inherited stubbornness of a family that had written refusal letters, and kept their documentation in order, and refused to accept that a wrong account should stand, when a true one was findable by someone willing to look. She had found it, and she walked through the city in the early evening, and the people moved around her, and she was part of it, and not lost in it, and the record was true, and the work was good, and the night was coming on clear. She walked. She had always known how to walk into a room. Now she walked into the rest of her life, with everything she had earned, and nothing she had borrowed, and no head bowed in any direction. She walked, and the city held her, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that a life, built right, should be.